Make France great again. This video is purely for entertainment and does not infringe on copyrights or laws. The rights to the novel and image belong to the original author. We do not claim ownership. Don't like waiting and want to listen to this fanfic in full now? Subscribe to our Patreon, where you'll find the best fanfics. Chapter 51, Arrive in Rome. May 22nd, 1848. Jerome Bonaparte, who had been sailing on the sea for 6 days in a sailboat, could no longer bear the damp, moldy, and stench-smelling environment in the cabin. He closed the book and got up and left the room. Walk along the cabin corridor until you reach the end, and the stairs connecting the cabin and the plywood appear to the right. At the end of the corridor, Jerome Bonaparte, who was holding a hard book in his left armpit, walked up to the plywood step by step, leaning on the wooden handrail of the stairs. On the plywood, the captain in charge of dispatching the crew saw the Golden Master. Jerome Bonaparte hurriedly ran up to him and greeted him warmly. "Dear guest, do you have any needs?" "Mr. Captain." Jerome Bonaparte, who was listening to the sea breeze rhythmically beating against the right side panel, who made the sound of the waves, swept away the haze that had accumulated in the cabin for a long time, and suddenly felt relaxed and happy. "I would like to ask, when will we arrive at the port of Civitavecchia? I can't wait to experience the customs of ancient Rome." Having said that, Jerome Bonaparte showed a slutty smile, whistled softly and added, "Of course there is also the tenderness of a Roman woman." Ugh. Another rambunctious aristocrat. The captain looked at Jerome Bonaparte, who was a prostitute in front of him, with a mixture of envy and jealousy. With a regretful expression on his face, he said, "Guest, in fact, you should have gone to Rome 2 months ago. Now, Rome isn't very fun, huh?" Jerome Bonaparte asked in confusion. "Why do you say that?" "The busiest time in Rome is on February 22nd every year. The Carnival of Rome starts on that day, and only at that time can you see the enthusiasm of Rome." The captain swallowed and showed a wretched smile on his face. Said, "Whenever the Roman Carnival begins, the residents of Rome wear masks to walk the streets of Rome. Resentful young boys and girls, hungry ladies will act at that time. People like you, there must be no shortage of kisses." The captain's compliment did not make Jerome Bonaparte happy, but instead added a bit of doubt. Didn't the war on the Apennine Peninsula start long ago? Why are they still in the mood to continue the carnival?" Jerome Bonaparte asked in confusion. "Guest," the captain explained, "the progress of the war has nothing to do with Rome. Whoever comes to Rome must obey the rules of Rome. Because His Majesty the Pope is in Rome." The captain's natural expression made Jerome Bonaparte realize the power of the Holy See again. The 18th and 19th centuries were the last highlight of the Holy See's prestige in the secular world. The Pope, who has dual interpretation rights in the religious world and the secular world, has a higher prestige in central Italy than Napoleon was in France, let alone outside the papal state. The devout religious people even wish to go to the Holy Land to listen to the teachings. However, in Rome now, the captain hesitated for a moment, then reorganized his language. "It seems to be more fanatical than before. However, I think there should be no problem with the prestige of His Majesty the Pope." Speaking of which, the captain's aura was obviously lacking, and the revolutionary fanaticism seemed to have begun to conflict with the Pope's authority. "Dear Captain, I don't want to know what Rome will be like. I just want to know how long it will take us to reach the port of Civitavecchia." Jerome Bonaparte asked again. "Guest, we have passed the Strait of Gibraltar. It is now the Mediterranean area. We are expected to arrive in Civitavecchia tomorrow. I hope you are not in a hurry," the captain said quickly. "That's good." Jerome Bonaparte slightly walked to the bow of the plywood and sat down to read the unfinished books. The captain also continued to assign tasks to the crew. The sky was getting dark, and Jerome Bonaparte looked at the sunset that was about to descend to the horizon from the stern. He got up inside, and he was going to return to the stench-smelling cabin. Even though there were 10,000 reluctances in his heart, Jerome Bonaparte moved his body step by step and returned to the room from the stairs from the plywood. It didn't take long for a sailor to knock on the door of Jerome Bonaparte's room. He placed a small piece of salted pork knuckle, a few slices of slightly darkened bread, and an orange on a tray, and handed it over to Jerome in the hands of M. Bonaparte. "This is Jerome Bonaparte's dinner. Have a nice meal, sir." The sailor respectfully closed the door and left. Jerome Bonaparte enjoyed his last supper in bed with the help of a kerosene lamp hanging overhead, flickering and swinging back and forth. Chewing the unbearable salted pork jerky, Jerome Bonaparte secretly swore in his heart, before boarding the ship in the future, he must prepare the food on board in advance. Jerome Bonaparte, who had hastily finished dinner, flipped through the books again. Read 1. Until the kerosene lamp ran out of oil. Jerome Bonaparte closed his eyes and rested. At dawn the next day, the sailboat finally arrived only 3 or 4 miles from the port of Civitavecchia. The wind gradually decreased as the distance approached, and the sailboat was forced to travel slowly. At 9 AM, the sailboat dropped anchor outside the port of Civitavecchia. At 9:30, Jerome Bonaparte was awakened from his dream by Captain Letty, and the two came to the plywood. Under the leadership of the sailor, Jerome Bonaparte and Letty arrived in a small boat, land of the port of Civitavecchia. The moment he stepped into the land of the Papal State, Jerome Bonaparte's heart was filled with pride. He clenched his fists and shouted in his heart, "Papal State, here I come." However, Jerome's journey is not over. He must arrive in Rome. Since the war was limited to northern Italy, the Papal State still maintained a well-established post, and Jerome Bonaparte and Letty rented a carriage to go to Rome. Perhaps due to the influence of the Apennine War, the originally endless post road had only a few carriages. The carriages carrying the 4th-generation leader of the Bonaparte family galloped all the way along the spacious post road, from Civitavecchia to Rome. The 70-kilometer journey took less than 6 hours to reach the outskirts of Rome. Looking at the hills that gradually emerged from the horizon and came into view, and the magnificent buildings on top of the hills, a happy smile appeared on Jerome's face. "Your Highness, are we looking for a place to stay now?" Captain Letty asked Jerome Bonaparte. "Of course." Jerome Bonaparte responded without thinking. Chapter 52. Lucien Louis Bonaparte. Jerome Bonaparte and Captain Letty took a carriage from the northwest corner of Rome to cross the Tiber River, the blood of central Italy, when they were about to enter the main city, but were guarded by guards at the arched city gate outside Rome. The city gate soldier, who smelled of drunkenness, pointed at the carriageway with a halberd with a Sicilian taste and Italian accent. "I suspect that there is a rebellion against the Papal State lurking in your carriage. Let the people inside get off. I want check." "Sir, there is no chaos here. There are some honest foreign travelers in the carriage." The coachman got out of the carriage with a smile on his face. He half bowed and took out from his blue shirt pocket a slightly wrinkled handkerchief. Was carefully untied by the coachman to reveal 2 copper-bearing coins, the portrait of Gregory XVI, and handed it to the 2 guards guarding the city gate. Gregory XVI, Pope from 1831 to 1846. During his tenure, he established the Bank of Rome, the discount bank, and minted silver and copper coins with his own head. On weekdays, he used this method to enter Rome. "A little trifle is no respect. Please accept the 2 officers with a smile," the coachman said to the guards in a low voice. After the 2 guards held a copper coin honored by the coachman, their arrogant expressions instantly became more pleasant, and their tone was not as arrogant as before. One of the guards shrugged and said helplessly, "We don't want to either. To do so, we can't shirk the above requirements." "I know." The coachman bowed and nodded in understanding. Although the coachman hated in his heart how much he hated these gangsters who were trying to knock their bones and their marrow, he still had to lower his eyebrows and pretend to understand. People always have to eat, and there are not so many protagonists in the world. It is more of a laborer who has to put on a smile and face the person he hates while running around for a living. The soldier slowly came around the carriage, pretended to check the overall structure of the carriage, and knocked on the carriage at the same time. Afterwards, he returned to the gate of the city, nodded his head, and waved his hand. "Yeah. Very good. You can go in now." "Thank you." "Thank you, sir." The coachman was overjoyed and got back into the driver's seat. The 2 soldiers removed the barricade placed in front of the carriage to make way. Just as the carriage was about to enter the arched city gate in the second half of its life, a voice came from the city of Rome. "Wait." The coachman and the guard looked in the direction of the voice at the same time. A young man in his early 20s, wearing a white priest's robe, holding a Bible and a golden crucifix on his chest, appeared at the city gate. The coachman and the soldier instantly saluted the guy in front of him, and the soldier who was swaying straight and his body instantly point. The most difficult thing to provoke in Rome is this group of guys in white robes, even if the guy in front of him looks so young. Respected priest, do you have anything to do? The coachman asked the young priest in front of him with increasing respect. The young priest nodded slightly to the coachman. He walked to the front of the two guards and stared blankly at the guards. Father, please, excuse me. The young priest's gaze made the voices of the two soldiers tremble. The young priest still didn't speak. After a few seconds, he stretched out his hand and said to the two soldiers, money. When the two soldiers saw this, they immediately understood the meaning of the young priest and handed the 2 copper coins that had not yet been warmed up to the young priest. The young priest who took the copper coin made a light threat. Don't let me see you a second time, or you should go to the church to repent. Yes, yes. Soldiers who didn't dare to get in trouble could only express their understanding in a submissive manner. The young priest glanced at the soldier again and added, I will come here from time to time to check. Having said that, the young priest turned around and came in front of the coachman and handed the 2 copper coins to the coachman. No, I can't accept it. The coachman was obviously unwilling to accept the 2 hot copper coins because he knew that if he accepted it, he would likely be retaliated by the soldiers. These gatekeepers are not alone. They are collaborating with the gangsters in the city of Rome. This force may not dare to take revenge on the young priest, but they will turn their hatred on themselves. Once he has something to say, his family will go to drink the northwest wind. What? This is the money you deserve. The young priest obviously didn't understand the twists and turns, and he asked suspiciously, Father, it's not my money. It's not. The coachman tried his best to distance himself from the hot copper coins. One party wants to let the other party accept it, but the other party would rather die than accept it. The scene was at a stalemate for a while. Jerome Bonaparte, who was in the carriage, obviously could not bear such a meaningless waste of time. The 9-day sea life made him eager to find a hotel to wash off his sour smell. Riyadh1.com. Jerome Bonaparte got up and opened the door to get out of the car. Jerome Bonaparte was stunned for a moment as he got out of the car, his black eyes staring straight at the priest in front of him. Lucien? Jerome Bonaparte asked tentatively. The young priest, who heard someone calling his name, instantly turned his attention to Jerome Bonaparte and shouted in surprise, Uncle Jerome? Captain Letty, who followed behind Jerome Bonaparte, stared at the young priest and Jerome Bonaparte in astonishment. It stands to reason that the difference in youth between the two is not large. Charles Lucien, Louis Bonaparte, 1828 to 1898, the second generation of Cannano and the second son of Prince Musignano, the future Cardinal of Rome. Cough, cough. Jerome Bonaparte, who realized that Letty and Lucien Louis did not meet, hurriedly introduced to Letty, This is my cousin Cannano and Musina, Prince Enuo's son. Hello, your highness. Letty salutes Lucien Louis decisively. This is Letty. Originally the squire of your uncle Louis, now he is mine. Jerome Bonaparte introduced to Lucien Louis, who was also confused. Hello. Lucien Louis said hello slightly to Letty in front of him. Mr. Father, can I go? The coachman, who was hanging on the side, said in a low voice as he watched the meeting of the uncle and nephew in front of him. Lucien Louis also wanted to give the money to the coachman. Jerome Bonaparte shook his head, and then his eyes hinted at Letty. Upon receiving the hint, Letty quickly took out an unconverted gold pound from his pocket and handed it to the coachman. Chapter 53, Collusion. Jerome Bonaparte, who met his relatives in Rome, did not choose to continue riding the carriage, but entered the city of Rome on foot with Lucien Louis. Lucien, when did you enter the church? How come I don't know anything? Jerome Bonaparte looked at Lucien Louis' outfit and asked curiously. Uncle Jerome, we haven't seen each other for nearly 4 years. Lucien Louis reminded Jerome Bonaparte, and then explained, I was baptized into the church in 1844, and now I'm studying for a doctorate in theology. Universities in the 19th century did not have 3 levels, undergraduate, master, and doctorate, which meant that talented people could skip grades to study a 20-year-old doctor of theology. It seems that you are going to become the most learned person in the Bonaparte family. Jerome Bonaparte praised Lucien Louis with a thumbs up point. Although the ability of the entire Bonaparte family has never been linked to education, education is always a stepping stone. Just like his deceased cousin, Louis Napoleon, who was self-taught, he kept saying that, if he hadn't been in prison, he would have to get a doctorate. Jerome Bonaparte also did not go to school for a day, and most of his knowledge came from private tutoring. No. Lucio Louis waved his hand shyly and said, I still have a year to graduate. That's great too. Jerome Bonaparte did not shy away from his praise. By the way, Uncle Jerome, aren't you supposed to stay in London with Uncle Louis? Louis Napoleon, how did you come to Rome? Lucien Louis looked at Jerome Bonaparte in confusion. Huh? Jerome Bonaparte was stunned and said, has Uncle Pierre not replied to you recently? Pierre, Napoleon Bonaparte, from 1815 to 1881, the third son of Lucien Bonaparte, member of the Second Republic, member of the Senate of the Second Empire. Uncle Pierre and his father have not communicated for a long time. Did something happen? Lucien Louis asked again. Alas. Jerome Bonaparte sighed. His cousin Charles Lucien Bonaparte was really not a sociable person. Not only did his cousin, the late Napoleon III, have a bad relationship with him, well, even my own brothers are not in contact with each other. My cousin, your uncle Louis Napoleon, died in London. Lucien Bonaparte showed a sad expression, drew a standard prayer gesture on his chest, and said reverently, may God bless Uncle Louis who is far away in heaven. As for why I'm here, Jerome Bonaparte glanced at Lucien Louis, after hesitating for a moment, and said, Lucien, can I trust you? Lucien Louis said with a serious expression, I swear by the surname of my honorable Bonaparte and the name of God. Okay. Jerome Bonaparte told Lucien Louis the purpose of his visit. The purpose of my visit this time is to meet His Majesty the Pope. An audience with His Majesty the Pope. Lucien Louis repeated again. That's right. Jerome Bonaparte pointed to the north and said to Lucien Louis, the general election of the French Republic is not coming. I need the appeal of His Majesty the Pope. Uncle Jerome, haven't you given up yet? Lucien Louis instantly understood what Jerome Bonaparte meant. Uncle Jerome and the others were still working hard for France. How can we give up? We are only one step away from our eyes. Jerome Bonaparte nodded, clenched his fists and said, as long as we seize the opportunity and seize the throne of France, the entire Bonaparte family will benefit from it. Your uncles will be paid handsomely, and you, Jerome Bonaparte pointed at Lucien Louis and tempted, you will become a cardinal of Rome at the fastest speed, and you can even become God's spokesman on earth. The Pope Cardinal. Lucien Louis snorted a little harder. For every member of the church system, money is not the most important thing. The Red Cardinal's robe is their eternal pursuit. After the pursuit of rights, it is understandable to pursue money appropriately. Of course, Lucien Louis has no desire to pursue money. He just wants to benefit more people. After serving as a cardinal, what can I do? Lucien Louis of course understood that everything in this world is clearly priced, and if you want to become a cardinal, you will naturally have to pay a corresponding price. Does your theology teacher have any connection with the Pope? Jerome Bonaparte asked, while holding a blind cat and touching a dead mouse. Reading www.ucanshu.com. If it really doesn't work, Jerome Bonaparte can only consider going to the Church of Rome to apply. Pope Pius IX should meet him. My teacher is the teacher of the diocese's major seminary. I'll go and ask him. Lucien Bonaparte was not sure that his teacher could climb to His Majesty the Pope. After all, according to the promotion system of priests, his teacher needs to go further to become the bishop of the diocese near Milan, and then he can be promoted to a cardinal by the Pope. Well, it's troublesome. Jerome Bonaparte responded. Jerome Bonaparte and Lucien Louis chatted while walking, and soon came to the Piazza Venezia. Just come here. Jerome Bonaparte, who saw that he was getting closer and closer to the Palace of Bonaparte, said to Lucien Louis, Palace of Bonaparte. It was purchased by Lucien Bonaparte for the retirement area of Laetitia. In 1823, Jerome Napoleon also briefly lived in the country. Uncle Jerome, won't you come and have a seat? Lucien Louis said to Jerome Bonaparte, pointing to the southwest of Piazza Venezia. Jerome Bonaparte shook his head and refused. Forget it. Your father doesn't want to mix with us. And don't tell your father I'm in Rome. Since the death of Lucien Bonaparte, Napoleon's younger brother, president of the House of 500s, Charles Bonaparte has parted ways with Louis Napoleon's cabal point. If I let my cousin know that he is chasing his second son to pave the way for the ambitions of the Bonaparte family, I'm afraid that my cousin will not be able to resist and kill him directly. Jerome Bonaparte would never have disturbed the Charles family if he hadn't happened to meet Lucien Louis. Chapter 54, Prince of Connaught. The afterglow of the setting sun fell on the faces of Jerome Bonaparte and Lucien Louis, and it was time for the two to part. When leaving, Lucien Louis asked Jerome Bonaparte again, "Then where should I meet you again, Jerome?" Bonaparte immediately pointed to Letty and said, "Tomorrow Letty will take the initiative to meet you here and tell me where I live. What do you think?" Jerome Bonaparte lightly used his own hide to stomp the cement-paved Piazza of Venetia. Captain Letty gave Lucien Louis a slight salute to show his respect. "I see." Lucien Louis looked at Letty again, as if trying to memorize Letty's appearance in his heart. The uncle and nephew separated at the Piazza Venetia. Jerome Bonaparte and Captain Letty found a good hotel near the Colosseum. The boss in the off-season learned that Jerome Bonaparte was here after the long-term lease. It showed unprecedented enthusiasm. Not only assured Jerome Bonaparte that he would provide delicious food, but also hinted to Jerome Bonaparte that he could help Jerome Bonaparte to promote a hospitable Roman girl. After Jerome Bonaparte had a temporary impulse in his heart, in the end, the sense of divine mission outweighed the desire to reproduce, and he was determined not to cause chaos in the city of Rome. However, he still nodded slightly to show his understanding, and took out 5 golden cuties, and handed them to the innkeeper. The innkeeper saw the gold pound in Jerome Bonaparte's hand, and his face first showed a surprised expression. Then he resumed his usual smile, and took the gold coin handed over by Jerome Bonaparte. Who can have a grudge against kind these days? He doesn't care about the identity of the guest, as long as it can bring him benefits. Even the devil will trade with him. Jerome Bonaparte officially checked in at the hotel. The words are divided into two parts. Returning home, Lucien Louis was quickly criticized by his father, Charles Bonaparte, Prince of Connaught. In the courtyard of the Palace of Bonaparte, Prince Charles Bonaparte of Connaught pointed at Lucien Louis with a grim expression, and rebuked him like a bell. "Louis, didn't I tell you to go home earlier? Why are you coming back now? You know that Rome is in chaos now? You are 20 years old. You are not a child. Can you save me some snacks, Lucien?" Louis lowered his head and pretended to be a good student while listening to Charles Bonaparte's rebuke. He knew that once he had the slightest idea of refuting, he would not want to sleep peacefully all night. "My brother probably moved out because he couldn't stand his father's nagging," Lucien Louis silently complained in his heart. "It's really sad that I was in the seminary in Rome, and I finally got 2 days of vacation time to waste my father's nagging." Half an hour passed in Charles Bonaparte's reprimand. Charles Bonaparte thought that he had finally eradicated the son's loose thoughts and stopped reprimanding. The dry-mouthed Charles Bonaparte swallowed his saliva and continued to question, "Tell me, why on earth are you coming home now, Lucien?" Louis told his father what he had encountered at the gate of Rome. But the whole process concealed the meeting with his uncle Jerome Bonaparte. After listening to Lucien Louis' answer, Charles Bonaparte nodded with satisfaction. "Louis, I'm very happy. You have the ability to distinguish right from wrong." Afterwards, he turned around and said seriously, "However, the way you handled things was really bad. Why not? Isn't it our duty to punish the wicked?" Lucien Louis defended in dissatisfaction. Charles Bonaparte looked at this 20-year-old son with half-heartedness. He got up and patted his shoulder. "This world has its own rules, just like you helped. Did the lady of the carriage thank you?" Lucien Louis shook his head after a moment and said, "He keeps rejecting my kindness. Why is this? This is what I told you about the rules of the world. Those soldiers guarding the city gates are insignificant people in our eyes, but in the eyes of the coachman they are giants." Charles Bonaparte told Lucien Louis, taught by words and deeds. Then he patted Lucien Louis on the shoulder and said, "I don't object to you helping the weak. I'm even happy. The filth of the Holy See doesn't infect you, but sometimes you need to learn to deter." "Father, the Holy See is not dirty," Lucien Louis retorted. "Grandma and Grandpa are also devout believers, especially Grandpa is a cardinal." Charles Bonaparte was at a loss for words. Having lived with his grandmother, Queen Letizia, and his uncle, Cardinal Fish, for many years, he understood that his grandmother and uncle were devout and kind-hearted believers. Alas, Charles Bonaparte sighed and said, they are the product of an era. If it weren't for my uncle, your uncle, His Majesty Napoleon, it would be impossible for my uncle to become a cardinal. Then, let's just put another Bonaparte on the throne. Lucien Louis said bluntly, no way. Times are changing, and we no longer have a chance. Charles Bonaparte was obviously unwilling to believe in that ethereal dream of restoration, my uncle said. Before Lucien Louis could finish speaking, he realized that he seemed to have missed the point. Uncle? Who? Charles Bonaparte asked in a loud voice. Pierre. Louis, Napoleon III. Or Jerome? No, nothing. Lucien Louis took a step back slightly, feeling remorse in his heart. In the end, he was unable to resist Charles Bonaparte's interrogation, confessed to Jerome Bonaparte, and explained to Charles Bonaparte the news of Louis Napoleon's death. Louis, is he really dead? Jerome is now the leader of the Bonaparte family? Charles Bonaparte muttered to himself in a slack mouth. Although he doesn't like his cousin, he still grieves for his cousin's death. There are not many people left in the Bonaparte family. Yes. Lucien Louis responded. Charles Bonaparte once again got the news from Lucien Louis that Jerome Bonaparte wanted to meet the Pope. Is Bonaparte's bloodline really a curse? Charles Bonaparte didn't expect that his second son would step into the ranks of his two younger brothers. He couldn't help but doubt himself. Is the previous behavior of escaping correct, father? Lucien Louis looked timidly at Charles Bonaparte. Charles Bonaparte looked at Lucien Louis and said, Louis, do you want to be a cardinal like your great uncle? Of course. Lucien Louis nodded in response. Charles Bonaparte seemed determined to return to the room, and took out a radiant ruby from the drawer. This is a relic of the Empress Dowager, and now he will use this relic to open a passage for the Pope for the Bonaparte family. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 55, Bishop Musarelli. With the first ray of morning light on the head of Jerome Bonaparte's bed the next day, Jerome Bonaparte, who had struggled to finish washing up, ordered Letty to go to Piazza Venetia to inform Lucien of his place of residence Louis at 9 o'clock in the morning. Letty, who had been waiting for more than an hour, finally saw Lucien Louis, who came in a hurry. His Royal Highness, hello. Captain Letty saluted Lucien Louis in front of him, and would give due respect to Letty, every member of the Bonaparte family. At the moment, when Letty bowed and saluted, he did not observe Lucien Louis' twisted expression and erratic eyes. Mr. Letty, hello. Lucien Louis also said hello to Letty. This is the prince's address. If there is any progress, you can find the prince at this address. Letty handed a note to Lucien Louis. Okay, I get it. Lucien Louis nodded slightly. Afterwards, Letty handed another bill that could be exchanged for 150,000 francs to Lucien Louis and said, this is given to you by the prince. It is essential to manage the clergy around the Pope. You can do it in Rome. The bank will exchange the corresponding gold coins. Notes from the Rothschilds banks were synonymous with credibility throughout Europe. After taking the bill, Lucien glanced at the amount of the bill in his hand and was shocked. He quickly shied away and said, I can't accept such a sum of money. The prince said it. If it's not enough, we can continue to add more. Captain Letty ignored Lucien Louis' refusal and did not accept the bill that Lucien Louis handed over. Seeing that he could not escape, Lucien Louis could only accept Letty's bill and assured Letty that he would arrange for his uncle to meet His Majesty the Pope as soon as possible. I'll trouble you then. His Royal Highness will be waiting for your news at the hotel. Letty saluted Lucien Louis again and turned to leave. Lucien Louis watched Letty disappear into the crowd. He's my cousin's squire. A voice came from behind Lucien Louis. Father. Lucien Louis turned to look at Charles Bonaparte behind him. When Lucien Louis met Letty, Charles Bonaparte had been secretly observing Letty, and he did not show up until Letty left. Lucien Louis handed the bill that Letty gave him to Charles Bonaparte. Charles Bonaparte, who took the bill, glanced at the amount on the bill, and said with emotion, "My cousin really looks like the emperor back then." "You mean his courage?" Lucien Louis asked. "No, I mean the ability to spend money." Charles Bonaparte ridiculed. "He is just like the emperor back then. He is very generous, and doesn't know how to be frugal." "Then what about this bill?" Lucien Louis said to Charles Bonaparte with the direct bill. "Humph." Charles Bonaparte snorted coldly and said, "Just think, it's my cousin's compensation for us." "Father," Lucien Louis reminded Charles Bonaparte, "how should we contact the Pope?" "Just leave this to me." Charles Bonaparte took over Lucien's work. "You just need to make the final report to your uncle." "But," Lucien Louis wanted to say something. "Don't worry. I have been in Rome for more than 20 years, and I still have some connections," Charles Bonaparte said confidently. Only then did Lucien Louis realize that his father had been in Rome for more than 20 years, and his connections were much stronger than his own. Even when he was baptized, he was invited by his father to Bishop Murzel. "I'll trouble you then, father," Lucien Louis said to Charles Bonaparte. "Alas." Charles Bonaparte sighed. "This may be the mission given to us by the blood of Bonaparte. Since it is God's will, then I have to obey." Having said that, Charles Bonaparte asked Lucien Louis to go home first and open the passage to the Pope by himself. Charles Bonaparte, who watched Lucien Louis return to the palace of Bonaparte, put down a carriage. Charles Bonaparte, who was sitting in the carriage, quickly came to the outskirts of Cancelleria. The Chinese translation is the Palace of the Academy, the Pope's government agency in the secular world, where the first and last Prime Minister Pellegrino Rossi was born. At this time, the perimeter of the Palace of the Academy was full of people, and people waved back and forth holding banners that read "Democracy, Freedom" in black ink. "Sir, I can only send you here," said the coachman to Charles Bonaparte. Charles Bonaparte thanked the coachman and left the coach. Charles Bonaparte, who saw with his own eyes that the main entrance of the Palace of the Academy was blocked, did not choose to enter through the main entrance. He bypassed the crowd and came to the side entrance of the palace. 2 guards stopped him. Charles Bonaparte slightly tidied up his clothes and said with a stern face, "I'm Charles Bonaparte, Prince of Connaught. Riyadh 1. Bishop Musarelli invited me to the palace for a chat." Carl Emanuel Musarelli, April 19, 1797 to 1856, Italian clergyman, appointed by Pope Pius IX in 1846 as a member of the High Council, responsible for public education and the issuance of papal state publishing licenses certificate. The 2 guards didn't dare to show any slights and hurried out of the way. Charles Bonaparte was able to enter the palace. Charles Bonaparte, who entered the palace, quickly came to Bishop Musarella's office. Based on his own memory, he knocked on the door of Bishop Musarella's office. "Come in." Bishop Musarella's aged voice came from the door. Charles Bonaparte pushed in the door. Bishop Musarelli, who was wearing a white priest's robe, looked at Charles Bonaparte in surprise. Charles Bonaparte took the lead. "Dear Bishop, please allow me to take the liberty of disturbing you. I'm now discussing a very important matter with you, Bishop." Musarelli put down the book in his hand and looked at Charles Bonaparte and said, "My friend, I'm honored to listen. His Excellency, what do you think of Rome now?" Charles Bonaparte asked Bishop Musarelli. "Under His Majesty's guidance, pious Rome." Bishop Musarelli used formulaic language again. "Your Excellency, the guys gathered outside the palace are not like pious people." Charles Bonaparte immediately pierced the formulaic lies of Bishop Musarelli. "They are just lambs that have lost their way, and they will find their way back in time." Bishop Musarelli continued nonsense. Chapter 56. Bribery. Bishop, His Excellency. Charles Bonaparte raised his voice a few decibels and said with a serious expression, "I don't know if you really don't understand or if you pretend to be confused. As your friend, I feel obliged to remind you, the stray lambs outside can overturn all of Rome." Charles Bonaparte's words caused Bishop Musarelli to put away the polite smile on his face and instead revealed the rigidity and majesty of religion. His eyes could not help but show a trace of displeasure and boredom. Pointing at the door behind Charles Bonaparte with his index finger, he said, "Charles, my friend, if you are here to act as a lobbyist for some people, then please leave my office." Your Majesty has tried his best to relax censorship of books and newspapers. What else do those people behind you want? Since the February Revolution, Bishop Musarelli, who is in charge of reviewing newspapers and periodicals, has never had a good night's sleep. In addition to reviewing books and periodicals every day, he has to discuss with the cardinals in charge of the seminary and prisons near Rome about public affairs, the issue of education, not to mention the reconciliation of some democratic personnel and religious people in Rome. At 51 years old, he really felt more and more powerless at this moment of crisis. His good friend Charles Bonaparte would even cause trouble for him. If it wasn't for the fact that Bishop Fish, Cardinal Charles Bonaparte's uncle and grandfather, had a kindness for him, Musarelli would definitely let the guard shoot him out directly. After listening to Bishop Musarelli's words, Charles Bonaparte first showed a shocked expression, then returned to normal. He nodded and explained, "His Excellency, I do come here on behalf of some people's interests, but not on behalf of those in Rome. I'm here on behalf of the Bonaparte family." The Bonaparte family? Bishop Musarelli was puzzled. He didn't understand what interests the Bonaparte family had in Rome. Charles Bonaparte saw Bishop Musarelli's doubts, and he quickly said, "My cousin hopes to have a dialogue with Pope Pius IX, so he appointed me as a pioneer to contact me. I believe that the Holy See will definitely the Bonaparte family will not be rejected, and the Holy See also needs the support of a powerful country to ensure their position in the Apennine Peninsula. The Austrian Empire is obviously overwhelmed." Oh. Bishop Musarelli looked at Charles Bonaparte with great interest and joked, "Aren't you in contact with the other Bonaparte families? How do you go now to help them act as a talker, guest? The blood of the Bonaparte family is inexhaustible." Charles Bonaparte responded. In fact, in his heart, he would never be willing to swim in this muddy water. The authority of the Holy See is already in jeopardy, and there is no guarantee that the Pope will be forced to flee one day. At that time, what should he do? If it wasn't for his second son who was also caught in it, he definitely won't come off easily. "What do you need us to do for you?" Bishop Musarelli said straight to the point. "We hope that the Pope can send the gospel to France, so that the lost lamb can rely on it." Charles Bonaparte responded vaguely, and then added, "Of course, it would be better if you could see the Pope and explain in person. It's gone." As a wise man, Musarelli certainly understood what Charles Bonaparte meant. Use the Pope's prestige to speak to the Catholic forces in France and make them support the Bonapartists in the election. Having said that, Charles Bonaparte took out a pebble-sized ruby from his pocket. The gem was crystal clear and had no flaws inside. It could be said that he searched all over the Apennine Peninsula and couldn't find a few. "This is a gift from the Bonaparte family to His Majesty the Pope." Charles Bonaparte put the gem in front of Bishop Musarelli and then took out a bill. "This is Musarelli. Bishop, your gift." Bishop Musarelli glanced at the ruby on the table. A greedy desire flashed in his eyes, but soon disappeared without a trace. He knew that there were some things that he could not be greedy for. Bishop Musarelli glanced at his own share. The bill came from the Bank of Rome, and the amount was 1, 10, 100, 1000, 10,000. The bill was a full 100,000 francs. Even the bishop was a little surprised. "After this is done, the Bonaparte family will be rewarded with the same amount." Charles Bonaparte once again threw a blockbuster at Musarelli. After a long time, Bishop Musarelli breathed out a sigh of relief and said, "For a reward like yours, even a cardinal is more than enough." Charles Bonaparte smiled and said nothing. Cardinals are also divided into 3, 6, and 9 ranks. Although Musarelli has not been promoted to a cardinal, his status in the Pope's heart is much higher than that of some cardinals, not to mention that Charles Bonaparte and he were old friends who had known each other since his uncle and grandfather were still alive. Leave this relationship alone and don't go and follow the path of a cardinal you don't know, unless Charles Bonaparte's brain is rusted. I can explain the situation of the Bonaparte family to His Majesty Riyadh1.com, but I can't guarantee that His Majesty will meet you. Bishop Musarelli saluted before the soldiers. "Of course, you can help us. We are already extremely grateful." Charles Bonaparte knew that Musarelli was just polite. "Of course, I believe that His Majesty will meet you." Musarelli lowered his voice and continued, "After all, His Majesty was under that person's hands Charles Bonaparte showed a shocked expression. It was the first time he knew the history of Pius IX. Unexpectedly, Pius IX still has such a bad relationship with the Bonaparte family. That's trouble. Charles Bonaparte changed the subject instantly. The two continued to talk for a while, during which Bishop Musarelli secretly probed Charles Bonaparte's information about the Bonaparte family, all of which were deftly resolved by Charles Bonaparte. Knowing that there was no useful information, Musarelli euphemistically issued an expulsion order. Charles Bonaparte, led by his secretary in black robes, left the side door again and took a carriage back to the Bonaparte Palace. Bishop Musarelli, who had bid farewell to Charles Bonaparte, picked up the ruby tributed by Charles Bonaparte and set off for the Apostolic Palace in St. Petersburg Church. He wanted to inform Pope Pius IX of the news as soon as possible. Lucien Louis, who had been waiting at the Bonaparte Palace for a long time, saw Charles Bonaparte's arrival and hurriedly greeted him. "Father, have you succeeded? Let's wait for the good news now. I believe it won't be long before the Pope's special envoy will come. When that time comes, just stay them at your uncle's hotel." After Charles Bonaparte responded to Lucien Louis, he went straight into the main hall of the Bonaparte Palace. Chapter 57, Envoys and Gifts. As Charles Bonaparte had expected, Bishop Musarelli entered the Apostolic Palace to meet the Pope and informed Pope Pius IX that the gem was now wanted by the Bonaparte family. Feeling the unpredictable situation in the Papal State, Pius IX decided to leave a way for himself. Pius IX immediately granted the Bonaparte family's request and set a date. Musarelli, then please run a trip yourself. Pius IX said to Bishop Musarelli. "Yes, Your Majesty." Bishop Musarelli asked Pius IX and left. Looking at the background of Bishop Musarelli's departure, Pius IX's eyes were dull, and he muttered to himself, "This world is really becoming more and more incomprehensible." An old man in a red robe appeared in front of Pius IX from a dark corner, with white hair and a wrinkled face. He reported the situation to Pius IX in a low voice. "Your Majesty, Rome is getting more and more chaotic now. Many the forces have begun to move around." Pius IX frowned and said with disgust in his tone, "Have you found out the forces behind it? Most of them have been identified." The cardinal responded to Pius IX. "Then, let's do it." Pius IX gestured in the air with his knife. "I gave them too much, Your Majesty." The cardinal murmured, "I'm afraid it won't work now, and rashly intensifying conflicts may put our community in a predicament." "Then, what do you think we should do now? Are we going to be stabbed in the neck?" Pius IX said excitedly. The cardinal did not speak, and to this day, he has nothing to do. "Okay, I'm tired, you go down." Pius IX turned and sat on the Pope's throne inlaid with various gems. The cardinal leaves. Pius IX took out the ruby that Musarelli had donated, stared at it, and muttered softly, "The Bonaparte family, I wonder if you can control the beast of revolution like the original emperor." On the other hand, Jérôme Bonaparte, who lived in the Roman Forum, was not idle either. He was busy writing something while staying in the hotel. So much so that there is no time to appreciate the ruins of ancient Rome. Dang. Dang dang. A short knock on the door slowly woke Jérôme Bonaparte from the sea of words. He closed the pen and got up to open the door. Lucien Louis was standing outside the door with an unknown guy. "Uncle Jérôme," Lucien Louis said respectfully to Jérôme Bonaparte. "Prince Jérôme." Another guy saluted Jérôme Bonaparte while looking at Jérôme Bonaparte with curious eyes. "Who is this?" Jérôme Bonaparte asked suspiciously. "Uncle, this is Bishop Musarelli." Lucien Louis introduced to Jérôme Bonaparte. "Hello, Your Excellency." Jérôme Bonaparte bowed and saluted Musarelli. "Although I don't know what rank the guy in front of me is in the Holy See, the guy who can be brought before him by his nephew must be someone who can help him meet the Pope." Bishop Musarelli is the special envoy of the Pope. He is also the bishop who manages a review of Roman books and public education. Lucien Louis introduced to Jérôme Bonaparte again. Jérôme Bonaparte showed surprise on his face. He didn't expect this guy to be the Minister of Education of the Papal State. "His Royal Highness, maybe you don't recognize me anymore, but we met when Bishop Fish was still there." Musarelli was close to Jérôme Bonaparte. Jérôme Bonaparte still didn't remember. He could only fool the past sloppily. At the invitation of Jérôme Bonaparte, Bishop Musarelli and Lucien Louis sat on the long sofa. Musarelli, who was seated, immediately said to Jerome Bonaparte, "On behalf of His Majesty, I welcome His Excellency the Prince. His Majesty the Pope is also very pleased that His Majesty can come to Rome." Musarelli's polite words were also answered by Jerome Bonaparte with the same polite words. The two sides formally started exchanges. I followed the order of Pope Pius IX and invited Prince Jerome to the Palace of Religion. I wonder if His Excellency the Prince has time. Bishop Musatech asked Jerome Bonaparte. "It's done." Jerome Bonaparte's palm spread out on his thigh curled into a fist. Although his heart was extremely excited, his face still had a dull expression. "Thanks to the Pope for giving me, a devout believer, a chance to meet." Jerome Bonaparte shamelessly advertised himself as a devout believer. Musarelli also opened his eyes and said, "Nonsense. Your Majesty cares and helps every devout believer, especially a guy like the Prince." After touting each other for a long time, the two finally settled on May 31st, which is 4 days later. "Your Excellency, UU Reading www.urkanshu.com in 4 days. A Holy See carriage will pick you up. I hope you don't forget." Musarelli warned Jerome Bonaparte. Of course. Jerome Bonaparte kept in mind, "Right. Please tell His Majesty Pius IX that I will give him something important on the day I meet him." How much money does the Bonaparte family have? Bishop Musarelli, who regards Jerome Bonaparte's gift as jewelry, does not know that this gift is more precious than jewelry to some extent. "Then, I'll wait and see." Musarelli got up and left. Jerome Bonaparte and Lucien Louis sent Musarelli to the downstairs of the hotel. A carriage inlaid with the emblem of the Pope appeared in front of Bishop Musarelli, who returned to the Palace of Literature in the carriage. Lucien Louis was once again invited to the hotel by Jerome Bonaparte. "Look at this." Jerome Bonaparte handed Lucien Louis the unfinished manuscript on the desk. Lucien Louis, who took over the manuscript, first glanced at the content of the manuscript casually, and then his expression became more and more serious. Jerome Bonaparte, sitting opposite Lucien Louis, waited for Lucien Louis with his legs raised. Since the manuscript was not finished yet, Lucien Louis quickly finished reading it. He pointed to the manuscript in shock and said to Jerome Bonaparte, "Uncle, you wrote this manuscript?" "That's right." Jerome Bonaparte nodded reassuringly. Anyway, the original author of the manuscript was born 26 years later, so this pirated copy can completely kill the original. The original author probably never thought that someone could actually plagiarize across time. Chapter 58, See Pius IX. "Uncle, in fact, you are more suitable to join the Holy See than me." There was a hint of loneliness in Lucien Louis' eyes, and his tone was a little dejected. He didn't understand why his uncle, who had never studied theological system, could write such an article. Could it be that he was really born to know this? Thinking of this, Lucien Louis looked at Jerome Bonaparte with a hint of admiration in his eyes. Perhaps God really did not abandon the Bonaparte family. Lucien Louis silently gave himself hints for rationalization. Jerome Bonaparte obviously underestimated the great influence of the articles he plagiarized throughout the 19th century. Judging from the expression on Lucien Louis, the effect of the articles was really good. He kept silent and maintained a cold attitude. By Lucien Louis, "Uncle, I have a request." Lucien Louis said to Jerome Bonaparte extremely humbly and respectfully, "Lucien, our blood is the same. You don't need to use the word request. Just say anything if you need my help." Jerome Bonaparte responded briskly. Lucien Louis shook the manuscript in his hand and said to Jerome Bonaparte, "I hope to be the first reader of your magnificent work." "Of course." Jerome Bonaparte readily agreed to Lucien Louis' request, then pointed to his head and said, "But you may have to wait for some time. The number of words in this work is no less than a novel. I'm willing to wait for it." Lucien Louis continued to compliment, "A masterpiece always needs to be carefully polished. I believe your Majesty will cheer when he sees your work. This is more than a box of treasures, precious things." Jerome Bonaparte and Lucien Louis discussed the content of the article for a long time, during which Jerome Bonaparte recorded some important content of the conversation with a pen. Louis is indeed higher than Jerome Bonaparte in the field of theology. With the help of Lucien Louis' theological theory, Jerome Bonaparte once again clarified the content of his writing and the relationship between them, direction and what needs to be removed. The two talked from the sky until night fell. Jerome Bonaparte once again invited Lucien Louis to have a simple dinner and ordered Captain Letty to send Lucien Louis home safely. It's not a wise move to walk alone in Rome, where there are no streetlights and looming signs of unrest. Captain Letty, carrying the necessary smoothbore pistol, called a carriage on the streets of Rome. Lucien Louis sat in the carriage with Captain Letty. Amidst the tinkling of bells tied with red ropes on the carriage rang out, slowly disappeared into the night. Jerome Bonaparte, who watched the carriage go away through the window, returned to his desk. He was going to continue with his unfinished manuscript. In the remaining 4 days, Jerome Bonaparte, apart from the necessary food every day, was lying on the desk and writing hard. After 4 days of hard work all night, the introductory part of the book was finally completely written by Jerome Bonaparte. Looking at the stacks of papers on the desk, which were densely packed with French characters, Jerome Bonaparte let out a breath and muttered, "It's finally done." Then he wiped the sweat on his forehead, closed the pen dipped in water, and sorted out all the manuscripts, waiting for the Holy See's invitation. May 23rd at 3 p.m. A black carriage appeared in front of the hotel's door. Bishop Musarelli, who was wearing a black robe, quietly entered the hotel and knocked on the door of Jerome Bonaparte. "Your Excellency." Jerome Bonaparte greeted the reappearing bishop. "Your Majesty, the carriage is ready. Your Majesty has been waiting at the Apostolic Palace for a long time," Bishop Musarelli said to Jerome Bonaparte. Under the leadership of Bishop Musarelli, Jerome Bonaparte got into the Holy See's carriage. Captain Letty was left at the hotel by him to wait for news. In the carriage, Bishop Musarelli first apologized to Jerome Bonaparte. "Your Excellency, I am sorry that we didn't use a car that matches your identity. Your Majesty is afraid that excessive etiquette will attract the attention of other forces in Rome." Jerome Bonaparte, who was also unwilling to expose his traces to the sight of the Roman people, agreed with Bishop Musarelli's cautious attitude. The black carriage set out from the vicinity of the ancient Roman gladiatorium, circled most of the city of Rome, and then came to the vicinity of St. Peter's Square. After the two got off the bus in St. Peter's Square, under the guidance of Bishop Musarelli, Jerome Bonaparte entered the Vatican Palace. As soon as he entered the Vatican Palace, Jerome Bonaparte was stunned by the luxury in front of him. The whole hall seemed to be shrouded in a hazy golden layer. The combination of lintel swat. Riyadh1.com makes Jerome Bonaparte feel as if he is in the period of the ancient Roman Republic. The ceiling of the hall is a Genesis pattern stacked with different colors of marble, with gold-framed oil paintings of generations of popes hanging on the walls. Michelangelo's Peter from the Renaissance is displayed in the corridor on the right, which makes him feel like he has traveled from ancient Rome to the Renaissance. The 1,000-year-old Holy See includes almost all the cultural heritage from ancient Rome to modern times, and also includes the original sin from ancient Rome. Jerome Bonaparte looked at the art collection and golden decorations placed in the Vatican Palace in shock and felt the urge to loot the place. Musarelli looked at Jerome Bonaparte with a smile on the corner of his mouth. For the first time, he was as shocked by the sight in front of him as he was. However, as he entered more and more times, the shock gradually became a habit, and the idea of climbing up became more and more intense. "His Excellency, it's time for us to go," Bishop Musarelli reminded Jerome Bonaparte. Jerome Bonaparte, who had recovered, left together with Bishop Musarelli. The two passed through St. Peter's Church, and then went through the winding corridors and finally came to the Pontifical Palace. Bishop Musarelli took Jerome Bonaparte to the study room of the Pontifical Palace, and then confronted Jerome Bonaparte. They said, "Your Majesty is inside." Jerome Bonaparte pushed the door and entered. A man beside him was a white holy robe with gold trim, holding a golden scepter inlaid with gemstones of various colors, wearing a white holy crown, a white-haired round-faced old man who appeared in the heat. In front of Roma Bonaparte. He is Pius IX, the ruler of the Papal State and the agent of God on earth. Chapter 59. Test each other. Jerome Bonaparte hurriedly entered the study and closed the door, showing a modest gesture and offering a kiss to the old man in front of him. Kiss the ring on Pius IX's hand as a sign of devotion. Some devout believers would kneel in front of Pius IX and kiss Pius IX's boots. Every year at the carnival, a group of devout believers are summoned by the Pope. This kind of activity is not surprising. Pius IX silently waited for the second generation of the Bonaparte family's kissing ceremony to be completed. Your Majesty. Jerome Bonaparte, who had done the kissing salute, took a step back and continued to pay his due respect to the God on earth children of Bonaparte. Pius IX had a smile on his face, his eyes filled with memories. When I was young, I had a relationship with you. At that time, I was still in your uncle's army. As a lieutenant, I followed the Imperial Army to the north and south. Thinking about it now is really something worth remembering. Jerome Bonaparte listened quietly to Pius IX's memories. He was shocked at first, and then recovered as before. He replied respectfully, "That's our honor, so." Pius IX turned his attention to the rising star of the Bonaparte family in front of him. Pius IX, who served as Emperor Napoleon's guard and saw the honor of Emperor Napoleon, had to admit that this guy's appearance was the same. The appearance of Emperor Napoleon is somewhat similar. If you don't observe it carefully, people will mistakenly think that Emperor Bonaparte is returning to the world. You have offered me a gem of your family, and you want to get from me, from the Holy See, receive anything. Gem. Jerome Bonaparte flashed a dazed look in his eyes, as if he didn't donate any gems. Could it be Lucien Louis? Forget it. Wait until the meeting is over before asking. This is out of devotion to the Holy See. Jerome Bonaparte still put on an expression of "I'm a dutiful son of God. I believe in your piety." Pius IX nodded with satisfaction and added in his heart, "I'm afraid your piety is like your uncle. Of course, we hope that His Majesty can spread the gospel to France." Jerome Bonaparte politely sought support from Pius IX. "I'm afraid it will be difficult." Pius IX acted in a pretentious manner, shaking his head and sighing. "You should know that France is no longer a kingdom. It has now become a republic. The republic does not stipulate that His Majesty cannot pass the gospel." Jerome Bonaparte continued. "Alas." Pius IX sighed again and said, "It's not just you who want to ask me to spread the gospel." This old fox. Jerome Bonaparte certainly understood what Pius IX meant. How could a pope who was killed out of thousands of missionaries be shaken by a little touch? What he said before was just to give himself a he was thinking of his own delusion, and the other two of the more than one he was talking about were probably the Count of Chambord and Louis Philippe. "Your Majesty, the remaining two can't help you in a short period of time." Jerome Bonaparte simply said to a showdown. Now that the Austrian Empire is in critical condition, and the Apennine Peninsula has been shrouded in riots, I'm not sure it will. When will it come to the Papal States? Pius IX's face changed from being aloof to the world, to a contemplative face. Jerome Bonaparte hit the railroad while it was hot. "Your Majesty, I heard that the Austrian Empire has begun to agree to mediation. If the mediation is successful, they will cede part of the land to the Sardinian dynasty. At that time, Austria will definitely withdraw from the sphere of influence of the Apennine. Will the ambitious Sardinian dynasty tolerate a scattered Apennine?" Jerome Bonaparte paused, observing the gradually gloomy expression on Pius IX's face. "At that time, the Sardinian dynasty will definitely take action against your Majesty, you and the Kingdom of Naples. How can the Papal State without the protection of the Austrian army be able to war Sardinia? I, translator, want to expel the religious membership of the Sardinian dynasty." Pius IX said angrily, "Your Majesty, once the Sardinian dynasty decides to unify the entire Apennine, religious membership is already a necessity for them." Jerome Bonaparte said to Pius IX, based on history. Pius IX also understood this truth. It is no longer the Middle Ages, and the means of excommunication can no longer cause any substantial harm to a country. It is clear at a glance the importance of a complete Apennine Peninsula **** and a trivial religious membership. How can you make me believe that you can gain power? Pius IX said to Jerome Bonaparte in a showdown. "Your Majesty, now the whole French countryside is looking for a name." Jerome Bonaparte stretched out a hand and said confidently, "That is Bonaparte. As long as the system of universal suffrage is still practiced in France, then Bonaparte will surely be able to go up. What if not?" Pius IX asked back www.riyadh1.com then. "His Majesty the Pope, you are about to face a situation of isolation and helplessness." Jerome Bonaparte spread his hands and said, "At that time, the Republican regime may give you a place to live, but of course it's limited to a place to live. If you choose us, then the French army will be your faithful partner." Pius IX was silent, and Jerome Bonaparte knew that he was weighing the pros and cons of this matter. Jerome Bonaparte quietly waited for Pius IX's response. After a while, Pius IX said again, "I can spread the gospel to France. Thank you for your generosity." Jerome Bonaparte smiled. "However, not now." Pius IX continued, "You need to show me your abilities." "Sure. Enough. There is no rabbit but no eagle." The enlightened Jerome Bonaparte didn't think he could get Pius IX to add a blessing buff to him, and even if Pius IX wanted to add it to him now, he would not agree. At present, it is the sensitive period of the French provisional government, and I don't want to be missed by Cavaignac in the future. Of course, we will not disappoint you. Jerome Bonaparte. Pius IX responded. Then he took out a stack of manuscripts from the interlayer of his coat and handed it to Pius IX. "This is..." Pius IX looked at the stack of manuscripts in confusion. "This is another gift I dedicate to your majesty." Jerome Bonaparte responded to Pius IX. "No one has ever given such a gift since he became the Pope." And Pope Pius IX looked at the contents of the hand with great interest. On the first page of the manuscript is the tentative title of Catholic Economic Ethics. Chapter 60. Pope's version of the countryside surrounds the city. The title of the first page of the manuscript first aroused the strong interest of Pope Pius X. Before Leo XIII, Pius IX's next pope, there was no systematic article on the impact of Catholic ethics on economics in Catholicism, and devout believers always believed that the Holy Lord should not be smeared by secular copper infected, so that in order to take care of the beliefs of believers, Pope Gregory had to expand capital by a secret method. Many times, Pius IX secretly envied in his heart that those heretics, Protestants, were able to link their own church to money. If Catholicism can make up for the shortcomings of its own existence, then it will re-emerge and even suppress Protestantism once again. Thinking of this, the heart of Guging Bubo of the 9th generation suddenly swayed with ripples. "Maybe you can become the greatest pope of this century in your lifetime." Or thought grows wildly in Pius IX's heart like a weed. Pius IX carefully looked at every character in Catholic ethics and economics, for fear that he would miss important information. An introduction composed of only 50,000 French words. It took Pius IX almost an hour to read. After reading the first draft, Pius IX also looked at Jerome Bonaparte with an unbelievable look, as if he was looking at a monster. "Unbelievable." Pius IX whispered in a low voice, "Your Majesty, are you satisfied with this gift of mine?" Jerome Bonaparte said calmly. Pius IX looked at Jerome Bonaparte up and down again, but he still didn't want to believe that the article in front of him was written by Jerome. "Where did you get this article?" Pius IX asked the doubts in his heart. "Your Majesty, this article is because I feel that the Holy See faced the lack of theory in economics, so I wrote this article, hoping to help the Holy See to make up for its shortcomings in economics." Jerome Bonaparte with a devout expression, he told Pius IX, while making the gesture of prayer. Looking at Jerome Bonaparte's pious expression, Pius IX actually believed what Jerome Bonaparte had said to him before. Perhaps he was really different from his uncle. If the previous Pope Pius IX had to be different from Jerome Bonaparte and VI Pierre, based on the interests of the papal state, then now his inner balance is really beginning to tilt towards Jerome Bonaparte. The two kings of the Bourbon dynasty, Count of Chambord, Louis Philippe, were far from Jerome Bonaparte, who was of substantial help to the theory of the Holy See. I don't know how many of the disgusting touting letters I have received. Prince Jerome, I found that your article seems to only cover the face-to-face content of the introduction. Where is the rest of the content? Pius IX was eager to learn the rest of the content from Jerome Bonaparte. Whereabouts, Your Majesty, the rest of the theory is in the minds of me and my nephew, who has a high respect for the Lord. Jerome Bonaparte pointed to his own mind and said, "If you have anything to do with my article, if satisfied, I will do my best to finish them. Then, I will wait for the prince's masterpiece at the Apostolic Palace." Pius IX responded to Jerome Bonaparte. Then Pius IX and Jerome Bonaparte discussed some of the questions and propositions in the introduction. Your Majesty, you advocate the improvement of social relations to solve the problems of workers on the basis of the obligations of workers, employers and the state. This is not in line with the duties of the Holy See. said Bonaparte. Jerome Bonaparte looked at what Pius IX was referring to and thought for a long time before he remembered that this proposition was the content of Pope Leo XIII's first social encyclical New Things in 1891. Since the issuance of the New Things decree, Catholic parties across Europe, especially the Catholic parties in the German Empire, have grown like wild horses, and once became the second largest party after the Social Democratic Party. The power of orders is self-evident, Your Majesty. I would like to ask, what is the biggest political crisis facing the Papal State now? Jerome Bonaparte did not directly respond to Pius IX, but instead asked about Pius IX's current situation. Of course you can also, I said, that the Papal State is still singing and dancing, so there is nothing to discuss about this issue. The Papal State is now. Pius IX thought for a moment, then reorganized his language and asked tentatively, isn't liberalization enough? Jerome Bonaparte glanced at Pius IX in disappointment. The Pope still did not see the essence of the matter clearly. Your Majesty, I would like to ask, if it is really a question of liberalization, then you reading www.urkanshu.com. Why was there no crisis in the Sardinian dynasty? After all, the so-called liberalization is just a political game of some high society. The rights of the Papal State are in the hands of you and the cardinal order, and some people want a share. In history, the Papal State has also carried out a liberalization reform, but that reform was nothing more than an operation in 1830 to change the soup without changing the medicine. The times are changing, and the people who are reforming have not changed, so should I let these guys come in and get a piece of the pie? Why should I sit at the same table with those greedy guys? Pope Pius IX said angrily, Your Majesty, this is what I stand for. Since you don't want those greedy guys to enter, you must find an ally. Jerome Bonaparte said to the Pope, the Holy See needs to help those workers win rights and interests, help workers achieve freedom of association, and meet the wages needed by families. As long as you unite with them, Your Majesty will no longer need to retreat to those guys, and you can even use the workers in turn to force them to give up some rights and interests. Can this be done? Are those mob really willing to accept it? Pius IX said to Jerome Bonaparte in an uncertain tone. Your Majesty, Jerome Bonaparte hit the railroad while it was hot. Please believe that the Holy See is majestic in the hearts of the people of the Papal State. They were only used by the people with the will to lead to the current situation. As long as the priests from all over the world can organize them together, if you let those guys have no chance, then you don't need to make concessions to them. Pull a group of people to suppress a group of people. Jerome Bonaparte expounded to Pius IX the theory of encircling the city from the countryside, using the power of the rural grassroots to organize associations against the urban petty bourgeoisie, so as to achieve the purpose of balance. Chapter 61. Good election. Jerome Bonaparte had a long conversation with Pius IX, during which Pius IX asked about the existing questions in Rome, and Jerome Bonaparte did his best to answer Pius IX one by one. When night fell, at the invitation of Pius IX, Jerome Bonaparte felt at home. At the banquet, Pius IX talked to Jerome Bonaparte about many things about the emperor's army in those days. I felt that, if the emperor hadn't failed, he might have stayed in the French army, and maybe he could have been a general. Jerome Bonaparte complimented that Pius IX's current achievements are far beyond the level of French generals. The two with their own thoughts left in laughter. Jerome Bonaparte, who left the banquet hall of the Pontifical Palace, sat on a carriage specially prepared for him by Pius IX under the guidance of the priest. The carriage slowly drove away from the Vatican Palace. Jerome Bonaparte, who was half lying in the carriage, recalled what he had done today, and a smile appeared on the corner of his mouth. She has already done everything she can, and how the Papal State will go in the future depends on Pius IX himself. On the other side of the Vatican Palace, Pope Pius IX also did not relax. Taking advantage of the fact that it was not completely dark, he urgently summoned a group of cardinals loyal to him, Bishop Musarelli and the future first Prime Minister of the Papal State, Pararino Rossi, from July 13, 1787 to November 16, 1848, Italian economist, statesman, lawyer, served as the French ambassador to the Papal States during the July dynasty at the invitation of Pope Pius IX to be the first Prime Minister of the Papal State. He was assassinated in the Palais des Instruments. On November 16th, the cardinals who were forcibly awakened by Pius IX listened to the Pope's admonition with sleepy eyes. The current situation is really not the time to go into detail. Pius IX can only make a long story short and tell the cardinals the suggestion put forward by Jerome Bonaparte. The infighting cardinals who have been immersed in the religious world for a long time are not very good at the struggle of the secular world. They turned their attention to Perarino Rossi, who was recently hired by the Pope. Perarino Rossi listened carefully to what Pius IX said, and after thinking for a long time, he said, "Your Majesty, I think this is feasible. We can form a party loyal to the Pope like France, and in the election won a venerable clergyman." Perarino Rossi's words did not resonate silently with the cardinals, and certainly did not arouse their opposition. They were like a personal sculpture waiting for Pius IX's response. "Let's do this first. However, we have to do it step by step. Let's start with the economic year." Pius IX, who has not completely lost his will to reform, decided to try it first. If the reform falls into deep water, he will return by himself. With the unanimous consent of the cardinals and the approval of the Pope, the Papal State once again launched a vigorous reform. In order to ease social conflicts on June 1st, Pius IX solemnly preached in the St. Petersburg Church and announced why he responded to the voices of the Pope, which is expected to begin reforms in July. All of Rome cheered for a while, and almost everyone cheered for the Pope's enlightenment. And the demonstrations disappeared overnight. Moderate liberals, ultra-liberals and even Republicans are all waiting for the papal reformation to begin. Jerome Bonaparte just watched Rome's every move with a cold eye and continued to write the unfinished Catholic economic ethics. On June 10th, two letters from France made Jerome Bonaparte very excited. The people who wrote the letter were Persigny and Rawmeat. In the letter, Persigny told Jerome Bonaparte about the funeral of his cousin Louis Napoleon. After the body of Louis Napoleon entered France, it was admired by the French people. There was an endless stream of people from Calais to France to see him off. On the way, major newspapers like Sharks Smelling Blood were full of firepower to praise Louis Napoleon. Great achievement. After the body arrived in the Seine, it was welcomed back by the ruling Lamartine and Francois Arago. All the citizens of Paris came to watch, and there was unprecedented harmony in Paris. Under the auspices of Lamartine and Arago, the remains of Louis Napoleon, named after the Republican hero, were placed next to the remains of the Roman king at Invalides. After the funeral, the whole of Paris knew the legendary Prince Louis Napoleon. In Roude's letter, Jerome Bonaparte learned about the dynamics of Bonaparte's followers, as well as about his two cousins and his father, the old Jerome Bonaparte. Roude vaguely pointed out that after the body of Louis Napoleon was returned, his cousin Pierre Bonaparte wanted to replace him as the new leader of the Bonaparte family. Riyadh1.com. Due to the lack of availability with the approval of the Bonapartists, coupled with the opposition of his father Jerome the Elder and his sister Mathilde, his cousin could only retreat and join Lucien Murat in the election. Since then, two members of the Bonaparte family, father Jérôme the Elder, cousin Pierre Bonaparte, have run for election and become MPs. Their names and some heroic events in the United Kingdom are also in the Coffee of Paris, the museum spread, Roude's suggestion, and even the literary salon also spread his name, the credit of my sister Mathilde. On the day he wrote the letter, June 4th, his votes in the Seine had already ranked 4th in the Seine, not far from Thiers, who came in 3rd. Ye used bribe money to cheat to win votes, and in Corsica, Ron and Badger-Charent, his own votes were overwhelmingly won, which meant that he could do it if he wanted to enter the French land in a grand manner as a member of these three regions. Lamartine's agreement could not impose any constraints on him at all. However, Jerome Bonaparte would not do this. He had to abide by the agreement with Lamartine. Even if Lamartine's time in power is numbered, Jerome Bonaparte, who had read the envelopes of Persigny and Roude, let out a long breath, shook his head, and said to himself, alas, the Bonaparte family. After speaking, he took out the scratch paper from the drawer and wrote letters to Persigny and Roux respectively. After the two letters were bound, Jérôme Bonaparte called Letty over and handed the two letters to Letty, and then handed the bill of 300,000 francs to Letty, asking him to remit with the envelope. Fund Paris for the activities of the Bonapartists. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel. Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story, and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 62, Papal Reformation. Time flies by like a white horse, and in the blink of an eye, it has come to June 25th. With the rising enthusiasm of the people in Rome for political participation and the good news from Austria, Pope Pius IX had to walk out of the Apostolic Palace again, and went to St. Petersburg Church Square under the *** of Swiss guards, to announce the progress of the reform. Perarino Rossi, who was the chief advisor to Pope Pius IX, was brought to the fore by Pope Pius IX's appointment as Minister of the Interior. Perarino Rossi also delivered an inaugural speech in St. Peter's Square. Ennio Rossi announced his first set of reforms. In the plan, Perarino Rossi claimed that given that Rome is currently in an economic downturn, rashly implementing democratic reforms will only bring the Papal State's economy to the brink of collapse. Now the government's first priority is to revitalize the economy, so the prestigious nobles in Rome will be invited to discuss strategies to save the city. There needs to be further discussion about the strategy of the political year, and whether to implement a national assembly like France. As soon as these remarks came out, there was a small-scale uproar in St. Peter's Square, and some Republicans and careerists standing on the periphery of St. Petersburg Square were obviously not very satisfied. However, the commotion did not get a wave of responses from others like the previous demonstrations, and those who tried to agitate the residents on the outskirts of St. Petersburg Square were quickly caught by the Swiss guards. The reason for this is because many noble gentlemen with influence in the city of Rome chose to wait and see with satisfaction after hearing that Perarino Rossi was going to invite them to participate in politics without their covert help. Republicans and potential careerists would not have been able to accomplish anything. After the first phase of the reform plan was elaborated, Pope Pius IX once again appeared in the cheers of the much anticipated cheers. He used a sympathetic tone in St. Petersburg Square to publicly pardon those who wanted to agitate the people of St. Petersburg Square. This move made money again the hearts of the inhabitants of Rome. With the help of the Navy Army lurking among the residents, many citizens shouted "Long live the Pope" either sincerely or from the crowd. Pope Pius IX and Patriarch Perarino Rossi left St. Peter's Square and returned to the Pontifical Palace amid previous cheers. Early the next morning, the mainstream newspapers in Rome published speeches about Perarino Rossi. West is from France, and he will definitely transform the Papal State into a country like France. Everyone in Rome was looking forward to Perarino Rossi's next move, except for Jerome Bonaparte at the hotel in Rome. After 23 days of retreat practice, Jerome Bonaparte finally completed the main content of Catholic ethics and economics. As usual, Lucien Louis came to Jerome Bonaparte's hotel residence to help Jerome Bonaparte in reviewing the manuscript, and by the way, brought Jerome Bonaparte French newspapers. Perfect. Lucien Louis couldn't help but sigh again after seeing the exact word. Jerome Bonaparte, who was looking down at the newspaper, raised his head and smiled slightly after hearing Lucien Louis' praise. There can be no flaws in this book that encapsulates the wisdom of Christianity throughout the 19th century. If there is one flaw to mention, it is the exposition of socialism. Since the author of the original version wrote the book in the 1920s, it was the outbreak of socialism theory. Part of the article is a refutation of socialism. It is now the middle of the 19th century. The theory of socialism is in a wild period, and many theoretical knowledge has not yet come out. In order to prevent unnecessary trouble, Jerome Bonaparte deleted all aspects of the content. The whole book has also been reduced from 260,000 words to about 180,000 words. Jerome Bonaparte believes that, even if this part is lacking, the ethics of Catholic managers can still become the pillar of support for Catholic economics. Lucien Louis, who put down the manuscript, once again asked Jerome Bonaparte what he thought of the politics situation in Rome. Minister Perarino is still a little slow. Jerome Bonaparte sighed slightly. Uncle, I think His Majesty's willingness to carry out reforms is already a good signal. A little patience will definitely pay off. Lucien Louis responded optimistically to Jerome Bonaparte. Jerome Bonaparte got up and walked to the window. Lucien Louis also followed Jerome Bonaparte to the window. Jerome Bonaparte pointed to the Roman citizens outside the window and said to Lucien Louis, "Lucien, the Pope can wait, so can the nobles. Can they wait?" The wave of revolution has swept across Europe. Slowly the reform of the CCP will only cause the impatient people to dislike the regime even more. They can wait for a while, but they cannot wait forever. His Majesty's first step is already wrong. If it were you, what should I do? Lucien Louis asked Jerome Bonaparte. Either do nothing or be cruel. Jerome Bonaparte said to Lucien Louis, "If it were me, I would pretend to establish a constituent assembly, and then use the votes of the peasants to the clergy, sent it to the council and ruled Rome." What if they want to riot again? Lucien Louis asked again. "I just want to wait for them to riot." Jerome Bonaparte said with a grim expression, "If he doesn't riot, how can I declare in the name of the law that they do not obey the constitution? At that time, we only need to issue an decree to announce the insurgents are unconstitutional, and then they will be taken with the help of French knives in conjunction with the country's return group." Jerome Bonaparte made a gesture of raising his hand and dropping the knife, the meaning of which is self-evident. The current situation of the Papal State is not something they can handle by themselves. It needs a big country to use a bayonet to forcibly reverse the values of Rome. France will France help the Pope? Lucien Louis asked Jerome Bonaparte. "Look at this and you'll understand." Jerome Bonaparte returned to the desk and handed a French newspaper to Lucien Louis. The content of the newspaper is relevant resolution on dissolution of National Workshop. Do you know what this means? Jerome Bonaparte's tone was calm and a little scary. Lucien Louis shook his head and said he didn't understand. "This means that a massacre will be staged in Paris in the near future, and those urban management masters will tear off their disguise and start attacking the workers." Chapter 63. What's going on in France? The situation in France was as expected by Jerome Bonaparte. After the June 1st victory over the Louis Napoleon's remains, Paris indeed ushered in a temporary peace between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie once again recalled the glory of Napoleon's empire, while the proletariat believed that the government's welcoming of Louis Napoleon's body was to implement Louis Napoleon's theory of Prince Louis Napoleon and seek welfare for the workers. Under the false peace, those workers finally stopped for a few days. Lamartine also received unanimous praise in Paris for his strategy of welcoming the corpse of Louis Napoleon. His vote in the Seine surpassed Ladru, known as the friend of the workers, to become the first in the Seine. Everything seems to be going in the right direction. However, the illusion is an illusion after all. After a long wait of half a month, the happy workers did not wait for any reform measures from the government. Starving, they decided to protest to the National Assembly again. On June 15th, a group of workers rushed to the National Assembly, and the policemen who were in charge of guarding the National Assembly were disarmed by the workers. The once peaceful National Assembly was thrown into chaos by the emergence of workers after the workers explained their origins to the members of the National Assembly. They hoped that the National Assembly would face up to their demands. Perhaps because the workers were so numerous, the members of the National Assembly pushed Thiers out for negotiation. Thiers, in order to stabilize the workers, pretended to agree to all the workers' suggestions. The workers who believed in the justice of the National Assembly left with satisfaction. Although General Gulden, who arrived later, led the National Guard to arrest some of the workers, he was dismissed from the National Assembly after he had seriously lost points in the National Assembly. After this time, the National Assembly lost the last shreds of patience with the workers under the promotion of Thiers and others. Cavaignac, who served as the governor of Algeria and returned to Paris to report his duties, was elected as the Minister of War of the French Republic. The iron-blooded butcher will become the object of hatred of the Parisian working class after the executioner is ready. The next step is to act. Under the authorization of the National Assembly, Cavaignac secretly transferred more than 50,000 troops from the Seine and its neighboring provinces to the suburbs of Paris. Once the order of the National Assembly is given, they will go to Paris. On June 20th, everything was ready, except for kicking out the annoying ruling council. Under the proposal of the Falloux member of the Party of Order, Orthodox, the National Assembly decided to agree with the Falloux member of Thiers. After intense discussions, the newspaper on the dissolution of the National Workshop by the National Assembly appeared in Paris. The workers looked angrily at the remarks made. by the so-called Republican newspaper The National. They were unwilling to believe that the government they fought so hard for in February would abandon them in just 4 months. On June 25th, a huge parade began, with nearly 30,000 workers participating in the parade. The whole of Paris seemed to be occupied in an instant. Fear and disgust filled the eyes of the workers, who in their eyes were not at all people who shared their fate with them, but parasites throughout Paris, rioters who destroyed their peace. The workers moved forward fearlessly under the disgusted eyes of the property owners. They came to Paris City Hall and asked Paris to give them an explanation. However, what awaited them was not the government's mediators, but a cold notice. The notice said, according to the unanimous consent of the National Assembly and the ruling committee, the National Workshop will be dissolved. The young and middle-aged people in the National Workshop will be incorporated into the army, and the remaining personnel will be sent to other provinces to work. This notice is not so much a notice as it is a declaration of war from the bourgeois government. It was not the so-called nobles who issued this notice, but a group of scholars, psychologists, and poets, who should have stood on the same front as the toilet masses, but now they have become potential executioners who want the lives of the workers. When the workers were about to negotiate with the ruling council, Paris Mayor Marist met with representatives elected by the workers, who told Marist that, if the government did not rescind the order, they would start a revolution like the February Revolution, another revolution. The threat of the workers' representatives was not taken seriously by Marist. He arrogantly told the workers' representatives that either the workers would obey the government's order to dissolve voluntarily, or the government would force them to dissolve. The second condition does not have the preferential treatment of the first condition. After this incident, Marist became the Speaker of the National Assembly. "Sir, then we will defend our rights in our own way." The worker representative played the final message to Marist with trembling lips. Marist, who learned from a certain way that the army was stationed, was of course not afraid of the threat of the workers. Once the workers started to wait for them, it would be 50,000 troops who would cooperate with the thunder of the National Guard. Marist continued to speak to the workers in an arrogant tone. "You are welcome." The workers' representatives led the workers away. Riyadh1.com. They wanted to use this last time to mobilize. The workers' representatives led the workers away. Riyadh1.com. They wanted to use this last time to mobilize. National Assembly has also not been idle. Promoted by the Party of Order, a dictatorial proposal to suspend the power of the ruling council to be handed over to Cavaignac is being voted on. This proposal was made by Bastide, who succeeded Lamartine as French foreign minister. Bastide, a right-wing Republican who succeeded Lamartine as foreign minister in early June, and is also foreign minister in the government of the dictator Cavaignac. The Party of Order and the Republican right-wing members unanimously agreed to the proposal to suspend the ruling committee, and also announce the appointment of Cavaignac as the ruling party, and is currently the only ruling party in France. After the meeting, the Bonapartists gathered in Princess Mathilde's private residence to conspire. His Royal Highness is right. Those guys are really going to do something to them. Pessigny said excitedly. "Yeah. I didn't expect that they couldn't bear it so quickly." Rouet also sighed with emotion. Peace only lasted for less than half a month, and another revolution was about to be born. "My brother said no. What should I do next?" Princess Mathilde asked. As Pierre Bonaparte's intention to replace Jerome Bonaparte as the leader of Bonaparte was thwarted, the elder Jerome Bonaparte had no intention of Bonaparte's small group, and helped his younger brother Mathilde. Bonaparte became the backbone of the French Bonaparte. His Royal Highness instructed us in the letter to restrain ourselves during the martial law, and not let them find out that we missed it. Rouet, let all Bonapartists try not to be exposed to the government's side during this time. Yes. Chapter 64. Victor Hugo. Since Princess Mathilde ordered the Bonapartists to stop all activities in the near future at the mansion in the Rue de Courcelles, all the Bonapartists in Paris have stopped moving. They are like a VIP lurking in the dark waiting for the two giant, proletariat, and bourgeoisie, decide the winner. After the two giants decide the winner, the Bonapartists will once again go out to capture the winner's fruit. At that time, a weak Paris will not be able to stop the Bonapartists' victory. During the period when the Bonapartists were lurking, Princess Mathilde, as the interim leader of the Bonapartists, was also not idle. She kept her father Prince Jerome and Raoul closely watching the movements of the parliament while fighting again and again. In the guise of literature, we have invited influential and prestigious such as Victor Hugo, Sainte-Beuve, Balzac, Alexander Dumas, Merimée, and Miss George Sand, to hear more from their mouths. The news about Cavaignac, by the way, helped her brother Jerome Bonaparte to establish a good image in the literary world. Due to the good image Bonaparte had established for himself in recent times and the beauty of Princess Mathilde, the invited Parisian literati did not reject Princess Mathilde's invitation, and they were invited to participate in Princess Mathilde's workshop. The literary salon was held, and the location of the salon was Saint Gratien on the shore of Lake Enghien, which was Princess Mathilde's second residence in Paris, and was also her usual place to hold salons. At 7 p.m. on June 27th, the sun was setting in the west, and the deep sky was dotted with stars. Under the guidance of the stars and moonlight, a dark black carriage slowly and leisurely walked to the Mathilde mansion and stopped. Pushing open the car door, a lady in a white court dress and holding a fan made of ivory got out of the car. When she walked to the gate of the mansion slowly opened, and Princess Mathilde, also dressed in a blue dress with a string of pearls around her neck, appeared in front of the lady. The lady looked at Princess Mathilde in front of her with astonishment, and then asked with a smile, "I'm not too late. Miss George Sand, you are the first one here." Princess Mathilde enthusiastically took George Sand's arm and led George Sand into the door. The two walked and chatted like a pair of good sisters who hadn't seen each other for a long time. The originally quiet mansion instantly became lively. If you listen carefully, you can hear bursts of laughter from the second floor outside the mansion. Time passed quickly, and in a blink of an eye, it was already the agreed 8 o'clock point. During the 1-hour period, the mansion at Sainte-Beuve, Balzac, Alexander Dumas and others arrived in turn. The only one who was absent was Victor Hugo. Seeing that Victor Hugo had exceeded the agreed deadline, Merimée, who was Hugo's friend, decided to stand up and say half jokingly and half seriously, "Okay, guys, we can start. Only God knows, Rain, how long does it take that procrastinator to come? Maybe he's reading his masterpiece right now at some lady's mansion." Everyone in the smiled, and they set their sights on Mathilde, the organizer of the salon. At this moment, Mathilde, who was sitting with George Sand, glanced at the clock hanging on the wall, then got up and nodded. The literary salon officially begins. Sainte-Beuve first made a sharp comment on the recent news that appeared in the Paris newspapers, which attracted everyone present to participate in it. Even Mathilde couldn't help but participate in it. Although she is the organizer of this salon, her literary level entertainments are obviously far inferior to those of the literati present, so that she made some inappropriate jokes during the commenting process. However, everyone present knew Mathilde's level, and they did not embarrass Mathilde. Even Sainte-Beuve, who is known as the serpent in the commentary circle in Paris, smiled slightly, and the little mistakes of the beautiful lady will always be forgiven by people. In the salon, Sainte-Beuve made a lot of complaints about the number of words in Balzac's water, calling it "I can't wait to put a punctuation mark on every word." Balzac just smiled. Of course, After Zac got into the money he praised Balzac again. P.S. Some well-known literati in Paris charge for their manuscripts by line. The whole of France, and even the whole of Europe, did not think about Balzac's human-shaped codewriter. It can be said that the newspapers really love and hate Balzac. What I love is his talent, and what I hate is his style of writing. In a few words, the atmosphere of the salon became more and more climax with the passage of time. Just when the atmosphere was about to reach its climax, the servant in charge of guarding the gate informed Princess Mathilde of the arrival of Victor Hugo. "Gentlemen and ladies, our protagonist is coming," Mathilde said lightly with her hands. Everyone turned their attention to the door of the living room. Riyadh1.com. Victor Hugo pushed the door open and came in slowly. Lost friend Merimée was the first to applaud, and the rest of the people also cheered and applauded. Victor Hugo, whose face was exhausted, heard continuous applause before he could apologize. He looked at everyone present suspiciously. "My protagonist is here," Merimée said to Victor Hugo in a funny tone. "Merim, you." Victor Hugo looked helplessly at this old friend, who was making a fuss. He walked slowly to Balzac's side and sat down. Hugo, you look tired. What happened? Balzac looked at Hugo beside him and asked curiously. Alas. Victor Hugo sighed. He first apologized for not being able to keep the time, and also explained his reasons to everyone. It turns out that, since the order of the National Assembly, to suspend the ruling committee and appoint Cavaignac as dictator, Lamartine, in order to prevent the overreaction of the soldiers and workers in Paris, took his romantic friend Victor Hugo to the suburbs of Paris, to try convince those workers to lay down their arms fighting the government. With their crude weapons, is unlikely to succeed. Did you succeed? Mathilde asked. No. Those workers obviously won't listen to us. He treats us as lackeys of the government. Lamartine and I were kicked out. Victor Hugo shook his head and said in disappointment. It seems that a massacre is inevitable? George Sand covered his slightly open lips with a fan. I'm afraid so. We may be lucky enough to see a massacre. Half the Republic kills the other half. Chapter 65. The End of the June Revolution. Victor Hugo's self-deprecation silenced all the literati present. The whole meeting gradually fell into a dead silence from the original fiery heat. As the initiator of all this, Victor Hugo looked at the silent literati and realized that he might have screwed up this salon that he had finally formed. Save, why don't we face it with an optimistic attitude? Maybe the situation is not so bad. Having said that, Victor Hugo suddenly thought of something. He looked at Mathilde and changed the subject. Dear princess, where is Prince Jerome? Mathilde, who had regained her senses, responded suspiciously. Father is still living at the Rhine Hotel. I'm not talking about the old Prince Jerome and your younger brother, Prince Jerome Bonaparte. You don't know it yet. He already has more votes than me in the Seine. Victor Hugo said to the literati present. When the literati present heard Victor Hugo's revelation, they looked at Mathilde at the same time, and there was a hint of curiosity in George Sand's eyes. When the topic turned to her, Mathilde could only bite the bullet and say, my brother is traveling in Rome. It is estimated that it will take some time to return to France. Victor Hugo shook his head and said, fortunately, His Excellency the Prince didn't come back. Otherwise Paris wouldn't know what the chaos would be like. Yeah. Paris is now. Mathilde also showed melancholy on her face, but she wished that Paris would be more chaotic. Again, Princess Mathilde, does your brother intend to participate in this election? According to his votes, he is fully capable of participating in the election. Victor Hugo then asked. It depends on his will. Mathilde tried to practice take eye. If he is willing to participate in the election, let him participate. If he is not willing to participate, then there is nothing we can do. The current French political scene really needs to inject some living power. If it is always controlled by some people, France will become a backwater. Victor Hugo openly implies that Cavaignac's governance and the actions of the National Assembly, in order to have chilled the heart of the former Orleanist, now the Republican, he hopes to attract another force to the French political scene. Mathilde, if your brother wants to participate in the election, we can help you. George Sand took Mathilde's hand and said intimately, we still have some strength. That's right. Let those Chengguan masters go to hell. Dumas shouted. During the February Revolution, he was kicked out of the National Guard and was marginalized from the National Assembly. He was very angry with the National Assembly. Immediately after, Merimee and Sainte-Beuve also joined the ranks of denouncement. Mathilde looked at these friends in the salon and thanked them one by one. I've read Prince Louis Napoleon's The Elimination of Poverty. Victor Hugo once again diverted the topic and said, frankly, that book describes what the current republic should do. Public and free education, industry allocation. Victor Hugo talked endlessly about the content of eradication of poverty. Since everyone present had not read the content, they could only listen to Victor Hugo's solo speech quietly. Gradually, they were attracted by the big pie in eradication of poverty, and in their hearts there was an impulse that perhaps Bonaparte might be in power. Victor Hugo was like a Bonapartist who preached the contents of the elimination of poverty. After the speech, Victor Hugo looked at Mathilde quietly and asked, if the heat will this be possible, if Prince Roma is in power? To tell you the truth, my brother is also a supporter of my cousin. Mathilde said immediately, he once told me that the Republic must be generous. The Republic must implement the principle of redistribution, even if we for the concept of disdain for socialism, but we can't let the poor get poorer and the rich richer. Isn't this France the same as England? If Prince Jerome is really willing to follow his ideas, of course I'm willing to vote for him. Victor Hugo added in a brisk tone. However, all this will have to wait until we meet. Of course. Mathilde responded. After my brother returns to Paris, I will let him visit you as soon as possible. In Mathilde's Guide, a light-hearted literary salon turned into Mathilde's dazzling brother solo performance point after the salon. Everyone except George Sand was curious about Jerome Bonaparte. Mathilde took advantage of the situation and accumulated a wave of popularity for her younger brother. Time continued to move forward, and in a blink of an eye, it came to June 29th. On this day, dark clouds shrouded the whole of Paris, lightning shuttled through the clouds, and a storm seemed to be about to ravage the whole of Paris. East and southeast of Paris, the Paris workers who endured for nearly a week finally could no longer endure hunger. The government has issued an ultimatum to them. If they do not obey the government's arrangement and leave before July 1st, the government will use coercive means. Everyone knows what the government means of coercion. They are unwilling to leave Paris, and they can only choose to resist. Under the voluntary organization of the workers, they gradually advanced to the city hall and built barricades in the areas where the workers lived. The reason why they, who only possessed a few weapons, chose to revolt at this time was because the cannons of the government army could not be used on rainy days, which further shortened the gap between them. However, they still underestimated the determination of the reactionary government. As a military dictator, Cavaignac had long been waiting for the workers' uprising. 20 minutes after the workers announced the uprising and demanded the dissolution of the National Assembly. Cavaignac came to the barracks lightly, and the 6 generals were waiting for Cavaignac's arrival. Generals, let's start. Kill this mob. The Republic will never forget your contribution. Cavaignac's murderous words cheered all the generals present. More than 50,000 troops quickly entered Paris and cleaned Paris with the cooperation of the National Guard. The torrential rain also followed. The sudden torrential rain restricted the artillery of the regular army and gave the workers the opportunity to arm themselves. Many workers' armed forces took the opportunity to seize the weapons of the National Guard. However, all this has no effect on the overall situation. The regular army without artillery support still showed the ability to crush the insurgent workers. The barricades were swept away, and workers, women, and children were killed by the beast army that had entered Paris. On the cloudy day of June 30th, Cavaignac had gradually cleaned up the insurgent troops on the front line of the city hall, and the insurgent troops slowly retreated. On July 1st, when it was clear, Cavaignac broke into the streets of the suburbs of Saint Denis and Saint Martin and leveled the barricades with artillery. On July 2nd, the last of the workers' bases, the suburbs of Saint Anton and Temple, fell. At this point, the 100,000 uprising workers in Paris were slaughtered by Cavaignac, and the rest were sent to other provinces under the pressure of the army. If you want to know more about the June Revolution, you can read The Complete Works of Man. Chapter 66, Aureole Behind. On July 3, 1848, the vigorous June Revolution ended with Cavaignac's ruthless repression. The workers had no chance to wait for the social reform of their dreams and fell on the Paris barricades ahead of schedule with rifles and bayonets. The barbaric French army drove them out of Paris mercilessly, leaving them to fend for themselves. General Cavaignac, the blood-stained worker with both hands, also got his wish, and his temporary ruling position was successfully turned into the real first French government. It's just that the first ruling's right period is less than 5 months, and the election results will be finalized in December. At that time, Cavaignac will step down on his own. Of course, Cavaignac has another way, and that is to take advantage of his current right not to be constrained by any forces, to lead troops to dissolve the National Assembly, and he will become the first ruling in the true sense. This is also what Thiers and others in the Party of Order fear. However, Cavaignac, who had solved the domestic riot, obviously did not learn from Napoleon's ideas. He is smug. He believes that his decisiveness has saved France, and the whole of France should vote for him honorably in the December general election. But Cavaignac didn't. He knew that from the time he took the first ruling position, all his rights would automatically expire in December. The Party of Order could not have another Bonaparte in power, and they were even willing to unite with the Bonapartists in order to stop him. On July 8th, the reports about the massacre of Paris reached Belgium, Prussia, and Rome through newspapers in Paris. On this day, the weather in Rome, with a Mediterranean climate, was exceptionally hot. Even the people who gathered to parade in the past did not want to enjoy the feeling of taking a sauna. Under the scorching sun, every household opened the windows for ventilation. Even so, the whole room was like a sauna. Many people choose to swim in the Tiber River to eliminate the impact of the sweltering heat. Jerome Bonaparte is also one of them. However, instead of going for a swim in the Tiber, he chose a shady spot on the upper Tiber to fish. Literally fishing. Also accompanied by Charles Bonaparte and his nephew Lucien Louis, Captain Letty brought a group of temporarily hired helpers with large bags and small bags and place the items and rocking chairs needed for fishing near the shade of the tree. Jerome Bonaparte and Charles Bonaparte were fishing with a fishing rod each. Crumbled breadcrumbs are sprinkled into the water to attract fish foraging. The struggling and twisted earthworm was mercilessly put on the hook by Jerome Bonaparte, threw it into the crumbs, and then sat on the rocking chair with peace of mind, yawning and waiting for the fish to take the bait. Charles Bonaparte put a ball of bait on the hook, glanced at the lazy Jerome Bonaparte and said angrily, "Paris is in such a mess, you are quite leisurely." Jerome Bonaparte squinted his eyes lazily and let the rocking chair sway back and forth, and the fish hook also went up and down with the rocking chairs back and forth. "Isn't that guy Cavaignac who made a massacre in Paris? As for all the fuss, Jerome Bonaparte's indifferent appearance made Charles Bonaparte extremely angry, and he even doubted whether it was the right choice to hand the ruby to the Pope. In order to appease his cousin, Jerome Bonaparte slowly opened his eyes and said unhurriedly, "Everything is under my control. Without Cavaignac, how could I have come to power? How can I come to power without Cavaignac?" Charles Bonaparte repeated Jerome Bonaparte's words again. He looked at Jerome Bonaparte suspiciously. Jerome Bonaparte had to explain to his cousin, before Cavaignac's horrific massacre in Paris, the Republicans enjoyed great prestige in Paris. Today, the prestige of the Republicans accompanies Cavaignac's dictatorship. As the **** fell, the selfless General Cavaignac helped the Party of Order, as well as us, to clear the most stubborn obstacles. I'm afraid that the Montagnards in the Parliament had long regarded General Cavaignac as a thorn in their eyes. Do the citizens who have experienced the turmoil in Paris and those moderate Republicans like to bomb Paris with cannons? Cavaignac, who had lost the support of the Montagnards and the citizens of Paris, was doomed to not have the majority of support even in Paris, not to mention the whole of France. Jerome Bonaparte paused, pointed to himself and said confidently, "However, I, Jerome Bonaparte, did not suppress the workers, nor bombard Paris with cannons. On the contrary, I will call on all classes to unite and get through together. In this difficult time, I will use a lot of infrastructure to stop the French workers from falling into unemployment. I also let the Catholic Church monopolize the right to education in France. I also have no experience in commanding the army like my uncle did. In short, I can satisfy the needs of the entire French people. Demand Riyadh1.com. What reason do I have to fail like this?" Jerome Bonaparte's confident answer made Charles Bonaparte seem to have traveled through time and space to the era of the Emperor. The Emperor was so confident back then. However, I have a doubt. Charles Bonaparte shook his fishing rod, and the simple float that was floating on the water plunged into the water. Quickly retracting the line, he also asked, "You have satisfied the interests of everyone in France, so whose interests have been damaged?" "No one was hurt." Jerome Bonaparte glanced at the fishing rod. He shook his head and said, "In other words, those who are hurt will not realize that their interests are damaged at all. The community of interests woven by Jerome Bonaparte with lies. Only the proletariat has suffered losses, but the proletariat has been deprived of rights by Cavaignac. After experiencing the **** repression, they only had hatred for Cavaignac in a short period of time. They had been deprived of political rights and could only use their votes to retaliate against Cavaignac. A sardine is taken off the hook by Charles Bonaparte and placed in a bucket. Damn. Do you really want the Air Force today, Jerome Bonaparte whispered something in Chinese. Although he is not a fisherman, the Air Force is the greatest insult to a fishing enthusiast. Just when Jerome Bonaparte was at a loss, Captain Letty walked up to him and handed Jerome Bonaparte an undivided letter. "There is Mathold's residence." "I'm sorry, Jerome," Bonaparte said apologetically to his cousin, who nodded and continued fishing. Chapter 67. Stubborn Pope. The letter from Paris was opened by Jerome Bonaparte in a corner backed by the shade of a tree. The sender, as Jerome Bonaparte expected, was his sister, Princess Mathold. In the letter, Princess Mathold reported to Jerome Bonaparte that he was safe, and then told Jerome Bonaparte some details about the June Revolution. After the revolution began, Princess Mathold, the old Prince Jerome and some important backbones of the Bonaparte party were divided into two parts and protected by some Bonapartists who carried guns. Although the whole of the suppression of the revolution was in the eastern and southeastern districts of Paris, Cavaignac still risked being hated by the French upper class and transported his artillery to the Saint-Germain district. Many wealthy people who participated in the National Guard were forced by Cavaignac bayonet to wear gorgeous coats and carry weapons that had never fired a single shot. Even so, they were still considered trash by Cavaignac. Mathold described in the letter, "In those few days, our Mr. Dictator was in the limelight, and the former MPs beat or scolded him in front of him, and even those who came and went on weekdays. The gentlemen of the upper class also come and go." Although his sister's statement contained some subjective assumptions, from Mathold's words, Jerome Bonaparte knew that the group of *** under Cavaignac's hands was very disgusting to the elites of the Western District. In Paris, if your actions make the elites useful, your rule is not far from being overthrown. 2 generations of Bourbons have been a typical example. Jerome Bonaparte then looked down. Mathold also mentioned Victor Hugo in the letter and claimed that Victor Hugo wished to have a conversation with him in Paris. If the conversation is pleasant, Mr. Hugo will choose to support Jerome. It's done. Jerome Bonaparte clenched his fists and muttered something excitedly in his heart. Victor Hugo and the moderate Republicans behind him are the people Jerome Bonaparte must win over. If Hugo can call on the voters of the Seine region to vote for him, then he will be sure of the votes in the Seine. At the end of the envelope, Mathold also mentions another proposal for Cavaignac in the National Assembly on July 4th. That is, given the impact of the June riots, he proposes to limit the votes of voters who should be those a person with certain behavioral capacity. If this proposal is successful, it means that all the previous efforts of Jerome Bonaparte will be in vain. The appeal of the Bonaparte family was not attractive to the elite, and it was difficult for the Bonapartists to win without the peasants. However, Mathold ends by saying that Cavaignac's proposal was directly rejected by a ratio of 50:700. The Party of Order, the Republican Party, and the Mountain Party rarely joined forces to deny Cavaignac, and they obviously did not want to see Cavaignac continues to be in power. After reading the letter, Jerome Bonaparte sighed in relief and stuffed the envelope into his armed sister Mathold's. Letter really made Jerome Bonaparte go up and down like a roller coaster. Jerome Bonaparte, who has now secured the victory, can only wait for his return to Paris for publicity. Jerome Bonaparte returned to the fishing spot in a good mood. At this moment, a kind-hearted old man appeared in the fishing area, and he was chatting with Charles Bonaparte. The old man, who saw Jerome Bonaparte coming, hurriedly saluted him. "Hi, Your Excellency. I'm Perarino Rossi." Jerome Bonaparte's face flashed a trace of surprise, and then his expression changed to a serious salute. "Mr. Interior Minister, hello." After some polite remarks, Perarino Rossi began to express his intention to Jerome Bonaparte. "I'm here to ask the prince some questions. Please, speak." Jerome Bonaparte responded. Perarino Rossi tells Jerome Bonaparte about his problems. Since Pope Pius IX announced the reforms, Perarino Rossi has started reforms, but in the reforms he used his experience in France to limit the amount of elections, appease the elite, and then try to put the clergy, introduced to counter the Roman elite. However, his reforms did not make any progress, but instead plunged himself into a swamp. After listening to Perarino Rossi's words, Jerome Bonaparte looked at the guy in front of him with a strange expression. He had already read the scriptures for Pius IX himself, and His Majesty the Pope was still doing things with the idea of 1830. Is it his own problem or the Pope's problem? Your Excellency, I admire Lord Gizzard so much. I think you should know about the history of French civilization written by Mr. Gizzard. Jerome Bonaparte asked Perarino Rossi. Of course. Perarino Rossi nodded. As far as I know, Mr. Gizzard, who wrote History of French Civilization, once kept some of the ideas of Saint Simonianus Riyad1.com. That is the part he is most proud of. Jerome Bonaparte said it is precisely the theory of class struggle applied by Gizzard, but Mr. Gizzo himself didn't. Perarino Rossi responded, the current situation in the Papal State is very similar to the time of the Great Revolution. The Third Estate challenges the First Estate. However, unlike the Great Revolution, most of the peasants in the Third Estate are willing to stand with His Majesty the Pope. If so, why not take their votes and turn the system into your own? Jerome Bonaparte said to Perarino Rossi. Perarino Rossi hesitated. Rome is not the foundation of His Majesty Pius IX. The foundation of His Majesty the Pope is in the countryside. Limiting the amount of elections will only exclude those who are loyal to His Majesty from the system, and some people with ulterior motives will hinder reform. Jerome Bonaparte to Perarino Rossi. Your Majesty doesn't want to lose his worldly rights. Perarino Rossi said in a low voice. There is no difference between a constitutional monarchy and an autocratic monarchy in the Papal State, as long as you can occupy the majority. Appropriate signals can ease sharp contradictions. Jerome Bonaparte responded to Perarino Rossi point. After thinking for a long time, Perarino Rossi decided to give it a try point, but before that he had to talk to the Pope point at this time. The sky was getting dark, and fishing had obviously become an empty phrase. Jerome Bonaparte and the others could only return empty-handed point on July 15th. Perarino Rossi, who persuaded the Pope, began the second round of reforms. Jerome Bonaparte was not in the mood to continue to pay attention to the political situation of the Papal State. After receiving the letter, he quickly wrote a letter to General Duffer, his protector in Paris. Chapter 68, Preparations before returning to France. In the political program of the second round of reform of the Papal State published in the newspaper, Jerome Bonaparte clearly felt the embarrassment of the Papal State's separation of hips and head, but it was a last resort point. The reform emphasized that the Papal State should follow the trend of history to establish a system that suits the national conditions of the Papal State. Therefore, the Papal State will implement a system of upper and lower houses. Members of the House of Lords will be joined by the College of Cardinals nominated by Pope Pius IX, and by Roman knights with noble titles. The House of Commons is elected by all the subjects of the Papal State, and the cabinet is formed according to the proportion of the parties in the House of Commons and the House of Representatives. If the parties in the House of Commons cannot hold a majority in the House of Commons, a person appointed by Pope Pius IX will be the Prime Minister of the cabinet. Of course, Pope Pius IX can also appoint his own prime ministers from this set of political systems. Jerome Bonaparte can see that Pius IX is not willing to completely lose his right to rule over the secular world. Otherwise he would not have added to the reform political program that the Pope can personally appoint the cabinet's right point. Of course, since the position of the Pope is elected by the cardinals in the House of Lords seem to be just mascots, but in fact they still control the entire Papal State. In Jerome's view, the second round of political reforms obviously imitated the French political reforms, but because of the inherent secular and religious characteristics of the Pope, a good French political reform has become a kind of French political reform in the Papal State. The four reforms are different point. Although the Pope under the second round of reforms lost some of his rights, he still holds the vast majority of the rights of the entire Papal State point. It is equivalent to changing from a reactionary absolute monarchy to an enlightened absolute monarchy point. The advantage of giving up some rights is that Pius IX can continue to gain the support of the Roman majority point if there is no external force to intervene. Such a strange reform will allow the Papal State to survive the dangerous European Revolution smoothly. Can all of this really meet Pius IX's wish? On July 17th, the first vote in the Papal State began. Pius IX and Perarino Rossi went to St. Peter's Square to announce the House of Commons to the residents of Rome, and announced to the residents of Rome that there were no members of the first cabinet. A list of temporary cabinet members pending election. Perarino Rossi was promoted to the first interim prime minister of the Papal State, and served as Minister of Interior and Foreign Affairs. Bishop Musarelli was also promoted to minister in charge of public education, and the rest such as Minister of Finance and Minister of Transportation. Most of them are also the clergy class, or gentlemen of the class close to the clergy point, although the prestigious nobles in the city of Rome were dissatisfied with Pope Pius IX's appointment of cronies. But now that the vote is imminent, they are not willing to compete with Pius IX on the temporary cabinet affairs anyway. They are just a temporary cabinet. Once they and their party are elected successfully. Not afraid that Pius IX is unwilling to fulfill his promise. On July 31st, a letter from Paris arrived in the hands of Jerome Bonaparte via the port of Marseille. The person responsible for delivering the letter was none other than Persigny. Seeing the servants from Paris rush over to Persigny, Jerome Bonaparte, who was sitting on the desk with his arms crossed, hurriedly got up to give Persigny a hug and said, "Persigny, long time no see. His Royal Highness, it's great to see you." Persigny excitedly responded to Jerome Bonaparte. Then, at the invitation of Jerome Bonaparte, the two sat on the sofa beside the desk. Upon seeing this, Captain Letty hurriedly brought 2 cups of coffee, a crystal cup filled with sugar cubes, and a small pair of tweezers to Persigny and Jerome Bonaparte. "Sugar cube?" Jerome asked Persigny if he wanted to add it. "No need. Thank you." Persigny picked up the coffee and stirred it quietly with a spoon. The rising white water vapor kept pouring out of the coffee under Persigny's stirring, and the brown coffee gradually became the brown and white soldiers appeared sticky. After stirring a few times, Persigny gently blew the water vapor floating on the rim of the cup, took a sip of coffee, and half of the fatigue of the car and horse was instantly eliminated. Under the influence of coffee, Persigny, who was struggling, explained the situation in Paris to Jerome Bonaparte again. Under the attack of Cavaignac, the whole of Paris experienced a temporary weakness, and now it is stunned again. Physical pain can be shut up by physical means, but mental pain can only be healed with time. After the revolution, General Cavaignac suffered strong resistance from moderate Republicans headed by Hugo. Hugo even threatened to claim that he would never support a scoundrel in power. Didn't our dictator take action against poor Mr. Victor Hugo? Jerome Bonaparte asked gloatingly. Read 1. Arrival of Cavaignac. He hopes that the more people who oppose Cavaignac, the better. Doing politics means making many friends and making few enemies. I heard that Cavaignac has made several fires in the office and claimed to arrest Mr. Hugo. Persigny also showed a tone of schadenfreude. However, our Mr. Dictator obviously did not the guts to keep Mr. Hugo behind bars, as he is now preparing for the December presidential election. I don't have the guts to carry out a coup d'etat, but I have the guts to suppress the workers. Our general dictator is really a man on his knees to make money. Jerome Bonaparte continued to ridicule Cavaignac, and then he asked, "By the way, do you have any difficulties with the promotion?" Hey. Persigny scratched his head embarrassingly and said in a low voice, "It's not that there are no difficulties, that is, we are always surrounded by a group of people when we post small advertisements, so that every time the party members are attacked by Princess Mathilde will save you, if you catch them." The corners of Jerome Bonaparte's mouth twitched slightly. According to Persigny's description, a relevant scene had already appeared in his mind. The propaganda of the Bonapartists had to rely on random advertisements. Is this the progress of the times or the degeneration of the Bonapartists? By the way, this is a letter from General Duffer to you. Persigny handed the letter to Jerome Bonaparte. Jerome Bonaparte opened the envelope to examine the contents. The envelope said that Jerome Bonaparte could leave for France under his guarantee. Go back to France. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 69. Last Meeting. For Jerome Bonaparte, General Duffer's letter represented a signal that he had received approval from the Cavaignac government to return to France. The arrogant General Cavaignac clearly did not see himself as an opponent. If that's the case, don't blame me for pulling you down from the position of dictator, my esteemed general. Jerome Bonaparte showed a disdainful smile at the corner of his mouth. The fate of the proud general of the republic has been doomed from this letter. Persigny, my friend. You have brought me an unexpected surprise. Jerome Bonaparte took Persigny's hand and assured, I assure you that once I become president, you are the secretary of the Élysée Palace. Jerome Bonaparte's assurance made Persigny's heart quicken a little, and a warm current rushed from his heart to every corner of his body. His hard work for the restoration of the Bonaparte family was not for the sake of becoming an important minister of the emperor one day. I am willing to serve your majesty. Persigny changed the title of Jerome Bonaparte from His Royal Highness to His Majesty. Jerome Bonaparte smiled slightly, and when he let go of Persigny, he shouted at Lady Letty, Your Highness. Captain Letty, who heard the shout, appeared at the door to respond. Quick, pack up. Tomorrow we will leave for France. Jerome Bonaparte said to Letty. Letty is also very happy. He has been away from France for a long time, and it is time to return to France. Yes. Captain Letty immediately acted to help Jerome Bonaparte clean up the room. Persigny wanted to help Captain Letty clean up the room together, but by the way, Persigny had a good impression in front of Jerome Bonaparte, but Jerome Bonaparte asked to go out together. Persigny had to put down half of his coffee and go out with Jerome Bonaparte. The two took a brown red open top carriage and went south along the ancient Roman arena to Piazza Venezia. 2 or 3 minutes after getting off the bus from Piazza Venezia, I came to the door of the Bonaparte Palace. At this time, Lucien Louis was just about to go out holding a theological book when he saw Jerome Bonaparte and Persigny at the door. Uncle Jerome. Lucien Louis greeted Jerome Bonaparte warmly. Persigny, who had never seen Lucien Louis, showed the same surprised look as Letty. Under the introduction of Jerome Bonaparte, Persigny also understood the identity of Lucien Louis. Your Highness. Persigny also greeted the Bonaparte member humbly. Hello. Lucien Louis didn't know Persigny's name and could only say with basic etiquette. Lucien, is your father here? Jerome Bonaparte slightly stood on tiptoe and looked at the courtyard behind Lucien Louis. Here I am. Under the leadership of Lucien Louis, Jerome Bonaparte and Persigny entered the Bonaparte Palace. Looking at the crosses on the walls of the Bonaparte Palace and the portraits of the Bonaparte families of all dynasties, Jerome Bonaparte's eyes were filled with reminiscence and he could not help but sigh with emotion. Everything here has not changed at all from that time, since my grandmother died. My grandfather, Lucien Bonaparte, ordered everything here to remain the same. After my grandfather died, my father didn't want to make a big deal. Lucien said as he walked. The three soon came to the courtyard. At this time, Charles Bonaparte was trimming his potted plants with a pair of large scissors, and next to him stood a man named Jerome Bonaparte who did not know what he should call it. The cousin is still Julien Bonaparte, who should be called the cousin. Jerome, here you are. Julien Bonaparte greeted Jerome Bonaparte warmly. Yes, cousin. Jerome Bonaparte still decided to call Julien Bonaparte his cousin. The last time we met, I remember it was 8 years ago. At that time you, Julien Bonaparte said, while gesturing the height of Jerome Bonaparte 8 years ago. Jerome Bonaparte listened carefully to her cousin's memories and nodded in agreement from time to time. Although he said that he had not experienced those things, he could still feel the warmth from the memories of the original owner. Okay, don't talk about those old things. Charles Bonaparte interrupted roughly when he stopped pruning the potted plants. Okay, you two brothers, let's talk. Julien Bonaparte felt Charles Bonaparte's anger and stopped recalling, and returned to the room. Father, I'm leaving too. I still have many questions to ask my teacher. Lucien Louis also quickly ran away. There were only 3 people left in the courtyard. Jerome Bonaparte, Charles Bonaparte and Persigny. Are you leaving now? Charles Bonaparte continued to use scissors to repair the potted plants, seemingly nonchalantly. It can be seen from the fact that Charles Bonaparte's actions of repairing potted plants are more messy than before. Riyadh1.com. He is not so careless. Yes. Jerome Bonaparte, how sure is it? Charles Bonaparte asked again. 90%. Jerome Bonaparte responded confidently. The moment I stepped into Paris, Cavaignac was lost. Do you need my help? Charles Bonaparte continued to speak, responded warm words in a seemingly indifferent tone. No need. You have helped us a lot. Jerome Bonaparte said to Charles Bonaparte, if it weren't for you, I might not have seen the Pope. I don't believe that you have no other means. Charles Bonaparte turned to Jerome Bonaparte and added, besides, I did it only for myself. If it wasn't for your kid who pulled Lucien into the you restore the group, and I will not be involved in it. Thank you anyway. Jerome Bonaparte continued, I won't rest assured of your family's kindness. The Bonaparte family will always be blood thicker than water. Charles Bonaparte had a bit of melancholy in his eyes. He murmured, I hope you can treat France well. That country can't stand the toss anymore. Jerome Bonaparte assured Charles Bonaparte that he would bring France to prosperity. Jerome Bonaparte said his final farewell to Charles Bonaparte and then rode with Pessinny to the Vatican Palace again. Under the guidance of the Bishop of the Vatican Palace, Jerome Bonaparte met Pope Pius IX again. Pius IX also sent blessings to Jerome Bonaparte and also expressed to him that Catholicism in France would definitely vote for Jerome Bonaparte. Chapter 70, Marseille City Election Status. August 2nd, 1848. The fiery sun rose slowly from the hills in the east, shining its light and heat on every inch of the land in the city of Rome. This is the hottest time of the year in Rome, and there are few pedestrians even in the streets in the early morning. Residents with meager assets in the urban area open all their doors and windows to get a little cool, while the slightly wealthier residents close their doors and windows and take out the ice cubes stored in the cellar the previous winter and put them into their houses at 8 o'clock in the morning under the shade of a tree at the entrance of the hotel near the ancient Roman Colosseum. Jerome Bonaparte, dressed in simple casual clothes, was standing still waiting for the arrival of the carriage. The dazzling sunlight shone through the shade of the trees to Jerome Bonaparte's back and arms, and sweat soaked Jerome Bonaparte's back and sleeves. The originally white shirt gradually became wrinkled and was firmly attached to Jerome Bonaparte's back. The moist and sticky feeling from the sleeves and back made Jerome Bonaparte have to constantly shake the shirt, and every shake drops a little sweat. After about 10 minutes, two brown open-top carriages appeared in front of Jerome Bonaparte, and Persigny and Letty were seated in one of the carriages. Persigny's carriage was parked within 5 steps of the shade of Jerome Bonaparte, and Letty's carriage was parked under the steps of the hotel. Persigny and Letty got out of their carriages at the same time. Persigny came to Jerome Bonaparte, and Letty entered a hotel along the steps. Your Majesty, get in the car. Persigny bowed to Jerome Bonaparte and invited Jerome Bonaparte to get in the car. Jerome Bonaparte nodded and got into Persigny's carriage, and Persigny took his seat right behind him. Letty on the other carriage also ran from the hotel to the carriage with a large bag and a small bag. When everything was ready, Jerome Bonaparte commanded the coachman in the driver's seat in standard Tuscan language, "Let's go." The coachman, who heard the order, gently patted the brown-red tall horse's buttocks. The horse that received the signal raised its hooves, and the carriage moved slowly. From the ancient Roman Colosseum to the outskirts of Rome, the carriages drove at a constant speed. When the carriage was completely away from the city of Rome, the carriage gradually increased its speed. As the speed of the carriage increased, waves of heat hit Jerome Bonaparte's body, and Jerome Bonaparte could finally feel a touch of freshness. Thanks to the sweltering heat in August, there were no carriages or pedestrians on the pipeline from Rome to Civitavecchia. The carriage that Jerome Bonaparte rode in could let go of its hooves and gallop. The straight line distance of 70 kilometers took less than 3 hours to arrive. After paying the fare, Persigny led Jerome Bonaparte and Letty to a cargo ship. Through Persigny's introduction, Jerome Bonaparte learned that the owner of the cargo ship was a Lamé retired military officer who was also a Bonapartist believer. As soon as he got on the ship, Jerome Bonaparte was surrounded by the enthusiasm on the ship. Under the leadership of the captain, everyone on the ship lined up in 2 rows and shouted, "Long live Bonaparte! Long live the Empire!" Seeing this, Jerome Bonaparte also echoed, "Long live the Empire!" Under the leadership of the captain, Jerome Bonaparte was arranged to the captain's own room. The whole room was incomparably tidy. From the layout of the room, Jerome Bonaparte could be sure that the owner of the ship must have sent someone to tidy it up in advance. On the wooden wall of the room was a portrait of the emperor crossing the Alps. Next to the portrait is a crossed command knife. "I'm interested." Jerome Bonaparte nodded to the captain. "Your Majesty, this is what we should do." The captain showed a flattered expression and asked cautiously, "If you have any dissatisfaction, you can come to me at any time. I'm very satisfied." Jerome Bonaparte looked at the captain. His eyes stopped for a moment on the captain's lame right foot, and asked, "Can you tell me your story?" "It's an honor, Your Majesty." The captain told Jérôme Bonaparte about himself. He was born in Provence during the imperial period. He lived in the imperial period and listened to the wounded veterans telling the story of the emperor's southern expedition and the northern war. He had infinite longing for the emperor. P.S. From a certain point of view, the veterans who were forced to return home because of the war were the best advocates for promoting Bonaparte. By promoting the tall image of the emperor, they contrasted their bravery on the side. When he was 9 years old, the empire collapsed. The Restoration dynasty set up the Homecoming Corps in Provence and liquidated the veterans and officers of the Napoleonic period. His neighbors and uncles became the target of liquidation, and even he almost became liquidation. Subject www.riyadh1.com. Speaking of this, the captain said in a hoarse voice, "I hate that **** dynasty. It made our lives a mess." Since then, the captain was determined to give the **** dynasty a good look. In order to complete his revenge, when he was 20 years old, he joined the Bourbon army and gradually became an officer in the Bourbon army. Before he could start his army's great cause of revenge, the Restoration Bourbon was overthrown, and Charles X was forced to flee. Confused, he could only follow the army into Algeria. He was injured in a counterattack in Algeria, and was forced to leave the army. Returning to his hometown, he relied on the treasure he robbed in Algeria to open a small shipping company in Marseille and other countries. Become a captain successfully. I look forward to the arrival of the empire all the time. The captain said to Jérôme Bonaparte, "Don't worry. The empire will return soon." Jérôme Bonaparte assured the captain. Then, Jérôme Bonaparte asked the captain about the voting situation in Marseille port. "Your Majesty, as far as I know, the situation in the Var province is not optimistic. Most of the little nobles in the countryside tend to be that guy Cavaignac." The captain first said to Jérôme Bonaparte politely, and then encouraged, "However, I believe that the majority of France is willing to support you." Jérôme Bonaparte was not surprised to hear bad news from mouth of the Rhône. In his impression, most of the votes for Cavaignac came from Provence. Provence is a gathering place for the Orthodox voting district, and those Orthodox diehards are justifiably hostile to him, a Bonapartist. However, if Cavaignac wants to beat him with the votes of a district in Provence, it is really difficult. Chapter 71, Astute Imitator. Jérôme Bonaparte continued to chat with the captain for a long time. When the cargo ship was ready to return to Marseille after unloading, the captain told Jérôme Bonaparte for the crime and left. Jérôme Bonaparte, who was sitting alone by the cabin window, stared blankly at the blue water with a little more anxiety and unease in his heart. This is completely different from his state of mind when he was in London and Rome, when he pointed the country. "Can I really lead them to victory?" Jérôme Bonaparte couldn't help muttering in a low voice. He couldn't help but think of his scene in front of his cousin's window. Eagle flag flying in France. I have no way out. Jérôme Bonaparte's eyes changed from confusion to firmness. Now he is carrying the dreams of too many people, and he has no right to give up willfully. The Bonaparte family either became the ruling family of France, or nothing at all. It was already 6:30 p.m. The afterglow of the setting sun shone on Jérôme Bonaparte's determined face through the cabin window as the cargo ship carrying the prince's ambition rushed out of the port of Civitavecchia. After a night of sailing, the cargo ship arrived at a sea area less than 5 nautical miles from Marseille port at around 7 a.m. the next day. The slight sea breeze blew the sails on the mast, and the soft waves were split by the keel to form a beautiful white trace, and the side panels made a pop sound due to the impact. In the musical score, intertwined by wind and rain, Jérôme Bonaparte, wearing a black corset and a jewel-encrusted command knife around his waist, gradually walked from the captain's room to the bow deck. A flowing blonde hair was blown by the sea breeze, and all the crew members on the ship turned their attention to Jérôme Bonaparte. After a while, they looked at Jérôme Bonaparte as if they had seen a ghost. The captain opened his mouth in surprise, relying on his vocal cords to say, "Your Majesty. Your Majesty." Jérôme Bonaparte smiled slightly. He opened his arms and embraced the air. His tone was full of pride and pride. "France, I am back. Your Majesty." The captain's voice grew louder. He admitted that Jérôme Bonaparte's dress was too similar to the emperor in the portrait at this time. If you don't watch carefully, it's really hard to notice the difference between the two. "Yeah. Jerome Bonaparte nodded to the captain, and he took great pains to make the coat that his uncle wore back then, in order to give the illusion that the emperor was back. Here he still has to thank his cheap dad. If he hadn't been born to be similar to his uncle, he might have to follow his cousin's route. When everyone says that he is the emperor's nephew, it's like now that he doesn't need to say that others will subconsciously recognize him as his uncle. At this moment, on the platform of Fort St. John in the port of Marseille, a large group of people were standing with awe-inspiring expressions, their eyes staring at the sea. They were all dressed in formal attire and top hats, and their attitude was dignified, as if they were going to meet the monarch. Standing at the head of the line was Fleury, and beside him was Rouet, a member of the French National Assembly. Looking at the endless waters in front of him, there was no sign of a ship on the horizon. Rouet asked Fleury, "Mr. Fleury, did your majesty really disembark at the port of Marseille today?" Fleury glanced at Rouet and said calmly, "Since Captain Letty said that his majesty will arrive today, his majesty will definitely arrive. I'm just a little worried in case there is an accident in the middle. Our plan." Rouet expressed the concerns in his heart. "Don't worry. There will be no accidents. I believe that God will bless his majesty," Fleury said firmly. Looking at Fleury's determined expression, Rouet was not talking, and he still prayed in his heart that Jerome Bonaparte would come sooner. "Look, a ship is heading here." I don't know which part of the crowd made the sound, but everyone's eyes turned to the sea point on the horizon. A cargo ship is slowly approaching the port of Marseille. "It must be His Majesty's ship," Fleury said excitedly. "It could also be an ordinary cargo ship." Rouet, who was standing aside, muttered inwardly, but his face still showed the same excited expression as Fleury. As the cargo ship gradually entered the range of Chateau d'If, many guys gathered on the platform of Fort St. John to join in the fun. These guys would watch on the platform whenever they were in port with a cargo ship. More than half an hour later, the cargo ship gradually stopped outside the port of Marseille. A small boat belonging to the navigator was released from the cargo ship. 5 people could be vaguely seen on the boat, 2 of whom were supposed to be sailors. The boat traveled through the narrow river and soon came to the platform of Fort St. John. When the boat reached the platform of Fort St. John, the people on the platform looked at the 3 people on the boat as if possessed. "Imperial subjects, how are you?" A cordial greeting seemed to have crossed time and space to the people of Marseille Port. Riyadh1.com brought the residents of Marseille Port to the imperial period. Could it be that His Majesty the Emperor has really recovered? The feelings of the residents of the port of Marseille cannot be expressed in words. Although they are a traditional royalist sphere of influence, how can they calm down when a real legendary figure comes to them? Long live Bonaparte. Long live the Empire. Just when everyone was shocked by the fake in front of him, Rouet seized the opportunity and shouted vigorously. Upon seeing this, the Bonaparte members who reacted hysterically shouted, "Long live Bonaparte. Long live the Empire." This frenzy successfully drove the residents on the platform of Fort St. John, who also spontaneously shouted, "Long live the Empire." The sound of hundreds of people shouting in unison alarmed the police officers who were executing near the platform from Fort St. John. The police, who were afraid of mass riot, cautiously approached the platform of Fort St. John. Jerome Bonaparte, dressed in the same clothes as his uncle, disembarked amid the shouts of the crowd. He deliberately lowered his voice to make it more contagious. "My compatriots in Marseille, my name is Jerome Bonaparte, Napoleon. Your Majesty is my uncle. Today I'm not here for the Empire, but for the Republic." As soon as Jerome Bonaparte finished speaking, the crowd shouted, "Long live Bonaparte" again. Jerome Bonaparte pressed down and continued, "I know that you are all the best citizens of the Republic. You have a lot to say to me, but my friends and I are very tired now. Can you let me go first?" The way. With the help of the police who came to hear the news, everyone on the platform made way, and Jerome Bonaparte left the platform of Fort St. John. Chapter 72, Paris Ballets. As soon as Jerome Bonaparte left the platform of Fort St. John, he stepped into the Boulevard Carnébert, known as the Little Champs-Élysées. Watching, people stopped just to take a look at this legendary man, who came out of gold coins. The Napoleon gold coins are printed with Napoleon Puget's head, which is roughly the same as Jerome Bonaparte's facial features when viewed from the side. The eyes of people on the street showed curiosity, surprise and even puzzlement. They couldn't imagine why a person who had been dead for decades appeared in France again. Jerome Bonaparte did not speak. He smiled and looked at everyone on the street. He walked slowly on the slightly damp street. The black boots under his feet hit the ground, making a clicking sound. It seems to strike the heart of every resident on the street who has heard the legend of Napoleon. The Bonapartists headed by Pessigny followed closely behind Jerome Bonaparte. They held their heads high and enjoyed the glory bestowed upon them by the Bonaparte family. Jerome Bonaparte continued to walk forward and subconsciously made way for the emperor and his entourage. Jerome Bonaparte and his entourage came to an end in the eyes of the inhabitants of the Boulevard Carnabia. Jerome Bonaparte stopped at the crossroad at the end. Seeing this, Pessigny quickly ran to Jerome Bonaparte and whispered to Jerome Bonaparte, "Your Majesty, the carriage just ahead. We'll take the carriage to Lyon and then to Paris by Lyon's train." The Paris-Lyon Railway was one of the railways built during Thiers' administration in 1840, and it was also the only railway from Paris to southern France at that time. Jerome Bonaparte slightly, then turned to look at the residents behind him. He cleared his throat and said to the residents of Marseille in a low and magnetic voice, "My residents of Marseille, I'm sorry that I don't have time with you. Have a great day together. Now, I have to go to Paris. Please vote for me in the next vote, and I will lead France to rise again." Having said that, Jerome Bonaparte raised his arms and shouted, "Long live the Republic! Long live the Orthodoxy!" Most of the members of the Bonapartist party behind Jerome Bonaparte showed expressions of consternation. Did their leader join the Orthodox faction? Only a few people, such as Rouet, understood Jerome Bonaparte's intentions. If you want to win the votes of Marseille, you must be good at deception. Long live the Republic! Long live the Orthodoxy! Rouet and the others also shouted hysterically. Then, Jerome Bonaparte and a group of Bonapartists continued to move forward and soon came to the place where the carriage was parked. In this huge convoy, the largest and most gorgeous gilt-trimmed four-corner open-top carriage is located in the middle of the convoy. The rest of the carriages seem to exist to protect this carriage. The side panels of the carriage are carved with waves, the family emblem of Napert. Needless to say, the guest that this carriage will carry is Jerome Bonaparte. With the help of Pessigny, Jerome Bonaparte slowly boarded the carriage. Pessigny and Eugen Rouet also boarded the carriage with Jerome Bonaparte. The one who was in charge of driving the carriage was still Fleury, who claimed to be the emperor's attendant. The carriage in charge of clearing the road ahead was driven by the skillful skill of the coachman. Fleury was also waving the whip and whipping the two tall horses leading the gorgeous carriage. The pain caused the horses to move forward, and the carriage also started slowly. After the carriage had driven some distance, Pessigny introduced to Jerome Bonaparte Eugen Rouet, who was sitting opposite him. "Your Majesty, this is Senator Eugen Rouet." "Your Majesty." Eugen Rouet saluted Jerome Bonaparte with his right hand under his left shoulder. Jerome Bonaparte smiled again. Whether it was Eugen Rouet in history or Eugen Rouet today, he showed his political sense and keen thinking that satisfied him. This was exactly what the Bonapartists were missing, and he wished there were as many Bonapartists as Rouet the better. "Eugen Rouet, you did a great job." Jerome Bona said to Eugen Rouet, "It's very rare for Bonapartists to have some outstanding visionaries like you." Rouet's expression showed a bit of stiffness. He didn't understand whether Jerome Bonaparte really praised him or took the opportunity to beat him. No matter what kind it is a big problem for you. Few people have great vision. Does it mean that Bonapartists are a bunch of rice buckets? Who knows that Mu-Xiu will be destroyed by the forest wind, doesn't want to have the impression of self-appreciation in the eyes of his colleague Riyad. This will affect his career in the future, not to mention that he is not like Pessigny, like Jerome Bonaparte, had a deep friendship with Jerome Bonaparte. He hurriedly said to himself, "Your Majesty, under your leadership, the Bonaparte faction has produced a lot of talents. I'm just the most common one. One of them cannot deserve the praise of His Majesty. You are humble. When Your Majesty was in London, he praised you for your serious work. I was by His Majesty's side at that time." Unlike Rouet's wild thoughts, Pessigny, who had worked with Jerome Bonaparte for half a year, understood that His Majesty's praise was sincere, and that Jane's future in the Emperor's heart of Rouet was absolutely limitless. In order to consolidate the relationship with Rouet, Rouet's eyes collided with Pessigny's, and from Pessigny's friendly gaze, Rouet heaved a sigh of relief. "Mr. Rouet, tell me about the recent events in Paris. Jerome Bonaparte said to Rouet again. Eugen Rouet told Jerome Bonaparte about the current situation in Paris. Under the negative effect of the June Revolution, the Republicans and Montagnards in the Seine were surprisingly voted, which should have been the fourth place. He suddenly emerged and became the well-deserved first place in the Seine province with an absolute advantage of 80,000 votes. Victor Hugo ranked second with 50,000 votes, and the third to fifth places were all absolute with 10,000 to 20,000 votes. The disadvantage is left behind, so Seine has already locked the victory? Jerome Bonaparte said excitedly. Your Majesty, my suggestion is that we better get Mr. Victor Hugo's votes too. Rouet said to Jerome Bonaparte, and the army's votes. Pessigny immediately interjected, many people in the army support you. They are also an indispensable force. Chapter 73, Hangman Banquet? Alas, it's a pity that their officers all follow that guy Cavaignac. Jerome Bonaparte sighed with emotion that the massacre order of the June Revolution enabled some officers in the army to be promoted. These heroes of the June Revolution united with Cavaignac in order to maintain the legitimacy of their merits. It is difficult to win their support now. Only after Jerome Bonaparte took the presidency and wooed them in the name of the emperor's nephew, these officers could enter his command. Your Majesty, I don't think there is any need to worry about the army. Rouet said with relief. According to his subordinate's observation of Cavaignac, that guy Cavaignac still wants to take the road of election. On this road, you firmly ahead. We just need to wait quietly for the final result. Yes, Your Majesty, at least the soldiers love you. Pessigny also responded. Jerome Bonaparte shook his head and said with a slightly grim expression, I don't want their love. I want to control them like an uncle, and I want to take them to get everything. This army beast must be to be tamed. I will smash the honor that the Russian Empire stole that winter, and I will trample the German Confederation that is so ugly that I vomit. Jerome Bonaparte's crazy words made Pessigny and Rouet shudder, and they never imagined that the leader they were loyal to was a war madman like his uncle. Oh my god. Couldn't France avoid being carried over by a bunch of lunatics? Rouet felt a sadness in his heart for what happened to France in the future, but this did not prevent him from continuing to be loyal to the Bonapartists. Only by changing the dynasty can Rouet be able to get everything he wants. Even if His Majesty the Emperor is really a devil, he has to bite the bullet and walk with the devil point. Besides, after the last failure, Your Majesty must have a plan in mind. Point. In order to ease the atmosphere. Jerome Bonaparte smiled again and crossed his hands. Of course, we can only do this until we have the power completely in our hands. Your Majesty, I firmly believe that you can lead France to regain the lost glory. Pessigny responded to Jerome Bonaparte with a pious face. I also firmly believe that, under your leadership, we will be able to achieve a greater victory than before. Rouet also complimented against his will. Gentlemen, don't say some compliments. I'm about to lose myself. Jerome Bonaparte chuckled and turned to see the endless wheat fields and the farmers working the wheat fields outside the window. Those people, they are all our votes, and they are what we protect. We must unite them against those who oppose us. Yes. Pessigny and Rouet also echoed. Jerome Bonaparte chatted with Eugen Rouet all the way and finally figured out the details of Eugen Rouet. He is a person who can share power with him. The time gradually went from 11 AM to 6 PM. After nearly 7 hours of journey, Jerome Bonaparte and others finally arrived from Marseille to Lyon. This city, which has existed since ancient Roman times, looks extraordinarily solemn under the reflection of the sunset. On the Rhône and Seine rivers in Lyon, several inland river sailboats are sailing down the river. On both sides of the river, you can vaguely see small black spots, and the residents who live by the river are carefully washing vegetables with vegetable baskets. Jerome Bonaparte, sitting in the carriage, admired the natural scenery in front of him. When the carriage entered the inner city from the periphery of Lyon, Lyon once again became an inland river trade city as traditional as Marseille. Many people on the street also turned their attention to Jerome Bonaparte. Your Majesty, we need to spend the night in Lyon. We will leave tomorrow. Eugen Raud said to Jerome Bonaparte. Jerome Bonaparte slightly in affirmation. The carriage stopped under the steps of a high-end mansion on Mermoz Avenue, and Jerome Bonaparte and others got off the carriage. The mansion owner warmly received Jerome Bonaparte and his party, and arranged the best room in the mansion for Jerome Bonaparte. Jerome Bonaparte, who entered the room, was just about to lie down on the bed and enjoy a moment of tranquility when he heard Percine's voice from outside the door. "Your Majesty, Marshal Biron's valet, please see me." "What? Marshal Biron?" Hearing the words Marshal Bigot, Jerome Bonaparte instantly thought of the hero of Algeria, the clown under Louis Philippe. Refers to the fact that in 1848 Louis Philippe could not bear the pressure from the masses and replaced Marshal Biron, who could have suppressed the Parisian uprising. Marshal Biron came to Paris like a clown, and then was abandoned by the monarch like a clown. By the way, he seems to be the commander of the Italian front now. Desperately wanting to establish a relationship with the military, Jerome Bonaparte got up from the bed immediately after hearing the name of Marshal Biron, and after a little tidying up his image, he opened the door. Riyad 1. Percine and him behind him, a middle-aged man in military uniform, who appeared to be in his 40s, entered the room. The attendant politely greeted Jerome Bonaparte, "His Royal Highness." "Hello. Hello." Jerome Bonaparte responded to the middle-aged man. "On behalf of my superior, Marshal Biron, I would like to express my sincere wishes to His Excellency the Prince. May His Excellency the Prince be successful in the election." The middle-aged man continued to compliment Jerome Bonaparte. "Thank you for the blessing of Marshal Biron," Jerome Bonaparte said perfunctorily. "Marshal Biron hopes that the prince can come to the barracks to inspect the army." The middle-aged man continued. "This old guy is hurting me." An idea popped up in Jerome Bonaparte's mind. Now that Cavaignac is still in power, the emperor's nephew ran to the military camp. Isn't that provoking an infighting in the Republic? Jerome Bonaparte's eyes flashed with disgust, but he was quickly hidden by him, and he still had a professional smirk on his face. "Thank you for the love of Marshal Biron. It's just that I'm worried about myself. Appearing in the military camp rashly will cause unnecessary disputes, so forget it." The middle-aged man showed a regretful expression. "Since the prince is unwilling to go to the army to inspect, then this matter is over. The marshal hopes that the prince will appreciate his honor and attend the banquet." Then, the middle-aged man added, "There are many young officers of the Republic who want to see His Excellency the Prince at the banquet. Should I go or not?" When Jerome Bonaparte was in trouble, Marshal Biron's banquet would definitely invite some promising officers in the army. If they are willing to support themselves, their future path will definitely be smoother. Chapter 74, Furious Lion. "Please say sorry to Marshal Biron and those French patriots who are fighting on the front line. I'm also very willing to communicate with them, but you know that in my current capacity, I'm afraid it will cause some problems from the authorities. Unnecessary misunderstanding." After thinking for a moment, Jerome Bonaparte still rejected this golden opportunity. Winning the army is only the goal of Jerome Bonaparte in the second stage, and the goal of the first stage must be to ensure a smooth passage of this time next general election. The essence of the French army is that whoever wins helps whoever wins, so he doesn't have to worry about finding people loyal to him after he wins the election. There is never a shortage of speculators in this world. As long as he sits in the Élysée Palace, those speculators will continue to move towards the center of power, always support the Élysée Palace, and whoever supported the Élysée Palace was still a universal truth in 19th century France. "Your Excellency the Prince is not giving face to the Marshal?" the attendant asked in a bad tone. "Anyone who is rejected in a row will not feel much better, especially someone like this who stays in the military camp with Marshal Biron all the year round, Mr. Attendant. I think I have made it very clear." Jerome Bonaparte refused to take care of the attendant's sentiments and refused. The army of the Republic should fight to defend the interests of the Republic, and it's not a small group to do some stupid things in private. You have to be worthy of the military uniform you wear on your body, and worthy of every penny that the taxpayers say to you. Jerome Bonaparte's yin and yang attitude completely irritated the attendant. He clenched his fists and took a half step forward. Seeing this, Jerome Bonaparte also moved his left foot slightly forward. The fighting posture of the deputy battle. The whole room was filled with swords and arrows for a while, and Persigny, who was standing by the side, was also a little overwhelmed, but he still slowly approached Jerome Bonaparte. A 2-to-1 situation was formed. Time flowed slowly in the game, and after a while, the valet released his hand and said to Jerome Bonaparte with hostility, "If you were my soldier, I would definitely use mine. Boots kick your asterisk 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 hard." Jerome Bonaparte also responded, "If you were my attendant, you would be fired on the day you took office. How can someone like you change?" The attendant thought that he had no time to talk to Jerome Bonaparte again. In his opinion, Jerome Bonaparte was an unscrupulous guy who relied on the title of the emperor's nephew, and a complete imposter. "Since Your Excellency the Prince is not willing, then I have no choice but to tell Marshal Biron the news." After the attendant finished speaking, he turned around and left. "Who told you to go?" Jerome Bonaparte roared like a bell to the valet attaché who was about to leave. The attendant attaché who was about to leave was instantly shocked by the roar of Jerome Bonaparte, and the anger in his heart was also stirred up by the roar when the enraged attendant military officer turned to face Jerome Bonaparte. His anger was instantly extinguished by Jerome Bonaparte's lion-like eyes. This kind of demeanor, this tone. The emperor back then was exactly the same. The attendant who had been fortunate enough to see the emperor go on an expedition could not help but recall the scene when the emperor went to his hometown for inspection. He was only 7 years old at the time. The appearance of the emperor and his angry demeanor were clearly imprinted in his heart, which made him difficult for a long time forget. "Your Majesty, Your Majesty," the attendant shouted to Jerome Bonaparte in a trembling voice. Jerome Bonaparte was stunned by the shouting of the valet. He looked at the valet and said coldly, "Sir, your words and actions just offended me. I need you to apologize for your words and actions." The attendant opened his mouth and coldly refuted all the way. That luck exactly like the emperor had already made him no longer in the mood to fight against it. At this time, he couldn't help but secretly regret that he had just been so fascinated that he didn't set his own position. "I'm sorry, I offended you, Your Excellency," the attendant said to Jerome Bonaparte in a low voice, but he didn't even have a trace of resentment in his heart, and there was even a little cooing point. Perhaps only the Bonaparte family can lead them back to the top point in the eyes of the attendant. The image of Jerome Bonaparte overlapped with the influence of the emperor at the time, and there was a hint of fanaticism in his eyes. "I forgive you," Jerome Bonaparte said generously, and then added, "Mr. Officer, please tell me your name." "Alfonso Bido." The attendant stood upright Riyadh1.com and said his name clearly, and then continued, "Currently serving as the deputy of Marshal Biron and the commander of the 1st Division of the Italian front." Jerome Bonaparte recalled Alfonso Bido's name in his mind. He seemed to have seen this name somewhere. After thinking for a few seconds in his mind, Jerome Bonaparte finally remembered. The guy in front of him is not the guy who served as the deputy of Marshal Biron to suppress Paris in the February Revolution. It seems that he and Biron, two unlucky bastards, were abandoned by Paris in Lion Point. Although he was a little disdainful of Alfonso Bido, the abandoned son of Paris, Jerome Bonaparte still looked at Alfonso Bido with a look of surprise. "This general, just call me Bido, Alfonso." Bido's flattered expression made Jerome Bonaparte wonder if the guy in front of him was the legendary Shaker. "General Bido, please tell Marshal Biron I regret not being able to attend the banquet. Next time I will definitely visit Marshal Biron in person. Marshal Biron's stage should not be in Lyon, he should be in Paris." Roma Bonaparte was almost naked in writing a bad check to Alfonso Bido. Paris. Thinking of Alfonso Bido, who was able to return to Paris, the center of power, his heart burst into flames, and he hurriedly told Jerome Bonaparte that he would definitely tell Marshal Jerome Bonaparte what he said. After Alfonso Bido left, Jerome Bonaparte called Eugen Rouet again and told Eugen Rouet about Alfonso Bido just now. "Your Majesty, you have done a very good job. Now we can't get involved in things other than elections." Eugen Rouet complimented the measures taken by Jerome Bonaparte. Chapter 75, Biron 039's Betrayal. A mansion in the main city of Lyon. "You idiot. You are intimidated by every word. Are you still a soldier? Where did your courage in Algiers and Paris go? An old but energetic screeching sound came from the window on the second floor of the mansion, which caused the two soldiers in charge of guarding the gate of the mansion to perk up their ears to listen to the movement in the mansion. At this time, Alfonso Bido in the mansion was standing upright on one side of the desk, and opposite him was an old man in a white military uniform with medals on his chest. He was called the hero of Algeria, Marshal Bido, the hero of the French, the nightmare of the Arabs. When he took office as the governor of Algeria, he completely wiped out a large number of guerrillas entrenched in Algeria, which can be said to be the terminator of the guerrillas in Algeria. Marshal, you don't know. His Excellency the Prince is very angry like the Emperor of the past. Alfonso Bido tried to defend Biro. As a confidant brought from Algeria by Marshal Biro, Alfonso Bido could still argue a few words in front of the rude Biro. Biro looked up and down at Fangdo. Bido asked suspiciously, I remember your kid was born in 1804. Yes. Alfonso Bido responded. Have you met His Majesty the Emperor? Marshal Biro asked in surprise. I only met His Majesty a few times back then, and I was almost dismissed by His Majesty the last time we met. Marshal, I only saw His Majesty from a distance, when I was very young. It's not like you can always accept His Majesty's admonitions. Alfonso Bido explained to Marshal Biro. Shit's admonition. Marshal Biro yelled, and Alfonso Bido's words evoked Biro's memory. Every time I see the Emperor, I always meet in groups, and I can't say a few words in the middle. Words? The only time I saw your Majesty alone, I was scolded badly. Seeing this, Alfonso Bido didn't put on a serious face, but turned to a happy smile, and said to Marshal Kanjuro Ruo, Marshal, aren't you also afraid of your Majesty? Marshal Bruo was at a loss for words in an instant. He recalled the reprimand the Emperor gave him when he came back. At that time, he hadn't slept well for several days and nights until the Emperor's aide-de-camp, General Bertrand, told him that the Emperor wanted to summon him. At that time, he entered the Tuileries Palace tremblingly and anxiously waited for the Emperor's sentence, and finally the Emperor chose to let him continue to serve as a colonel. It was the first time he experienced the path from heaven to to heaven, so his memory is still fresh. He really looks like your Majesty? Marshal Biro asked again. Compared with the first question, he was less suspicious and more surprised. Marshal, I guarantee it with my reputation. The prince who has no anger is only somewhat similar to the Emperor. Once he gets angry, His Excellency the Prince is simply a trumpet majesty. Alfonso Bido vowed to compare Marshal. In that case, Marshal Biro scratched his head and seemed a little troubled. It seems that some people in the Party of Order are going to miscalculate. Bido, I bet if your information is correct, many people in Paris will like our prince. Your mightiness. Order? Marshal, they are going to attack the prince? Alfonso Bido looked at Marshal Biro in surprise. How? Do you think I knew that he would arrive in Lyon at this time? Marshal Biro cast a glance at Alfonso Bido and said with hatred, when can you use your brain more? Soldiers not only have to learn to fight a war, you also need political acumen. Afterwards, he added gloatingly, however, this is just a small temptation to borrow my hand. Those guys in the Party of Order both hope that the Italian boy, Jerome Bonaparte, will check and balance Cavaignac, and I don't want to let the boy's voice be too loud. I just owe those people a favor, so I will let you run. Now, I have done it. If the prince were to attend the banquet, wouldn't it be dangerous? Alfonso Bido said in a stunned manner as Marshal Biro said, the current Marshal Biro has overturned his previous impression of him. Not necessarily. Marshal Biro continued, if the Italian boy really stepped into the game, I'm afraid he would be targeted by the guy Cavaignac. At that time, he can only go to the Party of Order for help. After all, or because he is too loud in Paris, then what should we do now? Alfonso Bido asked Marshal Biro. I did everything the Party of Order asked me to do. Now everything has nothing to do with me. Marshal Biro crossed Erlang's legs and put on the posture of an old hooligan. In the end, it's just an internal struggle in Paris. It's just the commander of the front army. But, after hesitating for a moment, Alfonso Bido expressed his concerns. Your Majesty, will he follow us? After knowing the inside story, Marshal Biro hesitated for a moment and then said, "It shouldn't be possible. No one knows that this is a trap. What if those people in Paris sold us?" Alfonso Bido continued. You reading www.urkanchu.com. Marshal Biro once again recalled that when he suppressed the riots in February, he was abandoned by the king and the party of order. Those guys were enjoying themselves in Paris, but he had to stay in line. Thinking of this, Marshal Biro was very angry. He immediately took out the manuscript paper in the drawer, wrote "Be careful of Thiers" in French on the white paper, and then handed the note to Alfonso Bido. He said rudely, "Take this thing and get out." Alfonso Bido, who took the paper, immediately understood what Marshal Biro meant. He saluted Marshal Biro and left. Afterwards, Alfonso Bido came to the hotel, where Jerome Bonaparte was staying again, handed the note to Jerome Bonaparte, and revealed to Bonaparte the conspiracy about the banquet. After listening to Alfonso Bido's words, Jerome Bonaparte's heart felt like a roller coaster. In the end, he still underestimated the insidious politician Thiers. Even if he had a gentleman's agreement with him, Thiers would not hesitate to attack his ally. The name Thiers has been on the list of must kill in Jerome Bonaparte's heart. I hope you don't hold grudges against the Marshal. The Marshal is also a last resort. In the end, we still have to follow Paris orders. Alfonso Bido excused Biro in front of Jerome Bonaparte. Marshal Biro can tell me this news with sincerity and sincerity. I believe in the character of the Marshal. Jerome Bonaparte put on a broad-hearted appearance. He knew that Marshal Biro wouldn't live long. Next year, a cholera in Lyon could kill Biro, so why should he be the same? Checkmate. People fight. His opponent is always in Paris. End of this chapter. Thank you very much for reaching the end. Don't forget to like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription, or donation encourages us to continue. Thanks to everyone. See you in the next video.